Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 1061, Not Bad. Layla tried to find out where Zen was before she left the enchanted barrier tower. However, in the face of the boundless lost storm, she naturally couldn't know where Zen was or whether he had even been eliminated from the test already. So Zen reached the 18,000th mile, right? Layla smiled. Even though she had left the enchanted barrier tower before him, she was confident with what she had achieved. She knew that there was no way Zen would be able to beat her record. Admittedly, 200 miles was the best she could do. After reaching the 28,200th mile, Layla could feel the pressure. The lost storm could only be described as terrifying. The power of both thunder and fire mixed together, the extremely compressed wind blades, and the frost that could freeze anything. If Layla had tried to push herself and realize her full potential, she might have been able to travel another 1,000 miles further. However, she didn't think it was worth it. She believed she did her best and people were already impressed enough with her. It was more than enough for her that she had beaten ordinary warriors and the talented ones too. She could proudly hold her head high in front of anyone including Zen. It was so satisfying to see the astounded looks of all those warriors from the 13 palaces. She couldn't help but feel fulfilled as everyone looked at her with much respect and admiration. Layla, please come upstairs, she heard Yolanda's voice calling for her. Layla nodded lightly in response. Her embroidered shoes clattered on the floor as her small figure floated over so that she was in front of all the leaders. Before, these leaders never really paid that much attention to Layla. They were all powerful warriors that were qualified to be world lords and were regarded with prestige. Layla was just a junior compared to them. She was much inferior in terms of age and her cultivation base. But after what they had just witnessed, they regarded her now with respect and admiration. Even standing in front of these powerful figures, Layla wasn't nervous at all. Instead, she turned to the old man wearing a cotton robe and asked, if there's a reward for crossing 10,000 miles, shouldn't there be a reward too for crossing 20,000 miles? The old man was dumbfounded. He'd never considered before that someone could reach 20,000 miles. So he hadn't prepared a reward for such an achievement. One of the leaders said with a smile, there should be a reward for her. 28,000 miles. That's amazing, she deserves the best reward. I agree, she should get a reward at least for the new record she has set. Another one chimed in. The old man hesitated for a moment. What reward would be proper? He had trouble figuring it out. Suddenly, they heard a faint voice, I will give this reward to you. The leaders of the palaces were stunned when they heard that voice. They then saw a person passing through the barrier that the old man had placed. He was descending slowly towards them. The Lord of the Sunset World. What an honor to see you here. When they recognized who it was, they all stood up from their seats to greet him. They all looked at him with much respect. It should be noted that the leaders of the 13 palaces were all considered important figures in the Supreme Worlds near the Alliance. For example, even though Yolanda wasn't a world lord, the world lord of the spirit reading world treated her with respect when she went there for Zen. Of course, all world lords enjoyed the status and respect. The Lord of the Sunset World had an extremely high status in the Alliance. He was a core member even among all world lords, and he alone controlled the 13 palaces' supreme worlds. His status was only second to that of the supreme lords, and only a few other world lords enjoyed the same status. While everyone regarded the Lord of the Sunset World with respect, Layla didn't seem like she could be bothered to show any respect for him. After all, she only cared about her reward. Upon hearing the World Lord's words, Layla excitedly asked, so you'll give me the reward, right? The Lord of the Sunset World nodded and looked at her kindly. Yes, little girl. I'm not a little girl. My name is Layla. Layla corrected him impatiently. Okay, Layla, the Lord of the Sunset World was amused. He cleared his throat, a bit embarrassed and then added, I was in a hurry so I wasn't able to prepare anything. However, I have 3 treasures with me, each of which can be considered a good reward for you. You can choose one. After he finished speaking, the Lord of the Sunset World waved his hand and 3 masses of light appeared out of nowhere in front of him. There was a precious treasure within each of them. 2 of the treasures were first-rank divine weapons, a snow-white sword and a light yellow saber. The last one was a feather robe, which was only a secondary first-rank divine weapon. However, since there were very few defensive weapons, this made the feather robe as valuable as the other treasures. The first 2 divine weapons are both ranked on the Universe Spirit Tablet. Although their rankings are very low, they are still far more powerful than any ordinary first-rank divine weapons. As for this feather robe, it is a defensive treasure that I unintentionally obtained, the World Lord explained. To everyone's surprise, Layla didn't hesitate at all and immediately pointed at the feather robe. "Are you sure you're choosing the robe?" the Lord of the Sunset World asked in curiosity. "Of course," Layla answered firmly, "it's the only one that looks nice." Upon hearing this, the leaders scratched their heads in confusion. Every treasure on the Universe Spirit Tablet was extremely valuable, but Layla wasn't interested in them simply because they didn't look nice. It was as if she didn't care about the treasure's real value. While the feather robe did look nice, it was extremely light and its surface reflected a variety of colors and patterns. It gave off an ethereal feeling. However, even then, most warriors would consider functionality above all, especially given a special opportunity as this. Very few warriors would choose their weapon based on appearance alone. The Lord of the Sunset World nodded and then he did some sort of gesture. The light containing the robe floated towards Layla, who then reached out to the mass of light and grabbed the gorgeous feather robe. It took her only a flick of the hand to wear the robe. She proudly spun around on her tiptoes, making sure to be graceful still. She'd always taken pride in her achievements. The Lord of the Sunset World then continued, "Now that she has reached such a distance, the Spring Fragrance Pavilion might send people to recruit her very soon. I wonder how Chiron will respond to it." Yolanda sized up the lively young girl and then answered, "Since Chiron has sent her here to undergo the assessment of passing the torch, he must have thought about this. I think he won't refuse the Spring Fragrance Pavilion." "That's good." The Lord of the Sunset World nodded. He suddenly turned to the Enchanted Barrier Tower, a curious look on his face. "Is there still someone inside the tower?" Yolanda nodded. "Yes, it's a warrior from my Mist Palace." "Oh." The Lord of the Sunset World took a careful look and said with a slightly surprised voice, "He has reached the 18,000th mile. That's not bad." In fact, 18,000 miles was not bad at all because it was excellent. This was Supreme Lord Illusion's record back then. Plus, Zen was actually at 18,300 miles already, which meant that he had already broken Supreme Lord Illusion's record. This achievement was far from not bad. However, since Layla had just set a record of 28,000 miles, which was 10,000 miles ahead of Zen's achievement suddenly paled in comparison. Yolanda discreetly pursed her lips and said, "Zen seems to be meditating. I think he's still going to go farther." Yolanda couldn't be sure. She had guessed that Zen would beat Supreme Lord Illusion's record and she had turned out to be right. However, she wasn't sure how far Zen could actually reach. She could only make a conservative estimate. Layla also looked towards the Enchanted Barrier Tower and said with a smile, "I agree. Zen's achievement is already great. He might go a bit farther and he might even reach the 20,000 miles mark." Yolanda shot her an annoyed glance. She disliked Layla for her arrogance. Layla seemed to doubt that Zen could break her record. Yolanda secretly hoped that Zen would beat her. However, she knew how difficult it was to break the astonishing record that Layla had just set. For some reason, she felt upset about this. The Lord of the Sunset World said, "Let's just see if this boy will surprise us. If he can reach the 20,000 miles mark, I will also give him my reward. I just wonder how long he's going to meditate there. It's a bit difficult to meditate inside the Lost Storm, after all." The crowd then fell into silence as they observed the last person in the Enchanted Barrier Tower. Zen hadn't moved in a while and everyone was wondering how long this would last. Chapter 1062, The Prototype. For the most part, there was no actual suspense regarding the contest results in the Enchanted Barrier Tower. Layla had not only broken the record set by Supreme Lord Illusion, but had also set a new record herself. She had raised the bar higher by setting a record that was even more difficult to beat. To put it simply, beating her record would be like turning the world upside down, impossible. Zen had broken the record set by Supreme Lord Illusion. In spite of that, everyone was convinced that he wouldn't be able to break Layla's incredible record. 18,000 miles was already an insurmountable record, let alone 28,000 miles. Since Zen was the last person to come out of the Enchanted Barrier Tower, everyone's attention was focused on him. As time went by, Zen remained motionless in the enchanted barrier tower like a monk in meditation, as if he was trying to comprehend something. Layla curled her lips and darkened her eyebrows. Her eyes shone bright, reflecting the strong light from the sun. Despite the first 18,000 miles being a bottleneck, it was relatively easy to finish. Beyond it, the law power was compressed to the limit. All of the law fragments were condensed together to form the Dark Law Storm. Earlier when Supreme Lord Illusion stopped here, it was most likely due to the Law Storm. However, Layla did not linger there for even a moment. After she opened Wrath of the Ocean, her focus kept her rushing on forward. Although the Dark Law Storm was fierce, it didn't pose much of a threat to Layla. Meanwhile, everyone else wondered what was going on inside Zen's mind. 2 minutes had passed. 5 minutes. 1 hour. 2 hours. 4 hours. The heads of the palaces and the Lord of Sunset World, however, remained calm. After all, they were all strong and experienced warriors. To them, this length of time was like a fleeting moment. On the other hand, the warriors in the plaza were starting to become a little anxious. It wasn't that they were feeling impatient. After all, they had gone through countless tough training and boring practices to become so strong and resilient. A mere few hours of waiting was nothing to them. Sometimes, when they practiced closed-door cultivation, they would spend at least an entire year with no one but themselves to keep them company. However, passing the torch did not consist of only one trial in the Enchanted Barrier Tower. They were eagerly looking forward to the next trial. With this expectation, it wouldn't be a surprise if they felt as though time was passing dreadfully slowly. What is Zen doing? He is wasting everyone's time. Who knows? There's nothing we can do about it. The next trial of passing the torch will not be activated unless he comes out of the Enchanted Barrier Tower. If he wants to continue, he needs to hurry up. He has already broken Supreme Lord Illusion's record. That's more than enough. What else does he want? To beat Layla's record. The complaints of thousands of eager people filled every corner of the place. Yolanda, whose pale eyes were narrowed and without so much as a glint, was also filled with immense curiosity. What was Zen thinking about? Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The law storm swirled around violently in a spiral pattern in front of Zen. It was divided into different levels. At 1,000 miles, the law fragments were still scattered, and gathering them together was no easy feat. Even after the initial condensation had occurred, what they formed were just tiny fragments of law power, which could only amass short wind blades or tiny fireballs. However, after 3,000 miles, the fragments of the law storm had gathered together on a massive scale. The further one went, the more condensed they were. After 10,000 miles, those law fragments would take shape on a massive scale. Their attacks would become even more terrifying and formidable. From 10,000 miles to 18,000 miles, despite the continual increase of power, there weren't any significant changes in the law storm. However, at this moment, the law storm in front of Zen had already been condensed to its limit. Multicolored laws had gathered together, swirling like a vast, gray fog. At first glance, the speed at which the law storm circulated seemed much slower than before, but in reality, because of the compression of the various laws, it was much more difficult to advance forward in them. The reason why Zen had stopped here was not that he was unable to pass the law storm, but that he had discovered that the highly condensed law storm was actually extremely similar to the chaotic energy in his body. By condensing all of the original laws to the limit, one will get the prototype of the chaotic energy. In fact, the similarity is staggering. Zen pondered as he stared at the law storm in front of him. The original laws of the law storm are the result of several Supreme Lords exchanging blows with each other. They transformed the vitality between heaven and earth into the law powers, making them interweave and compress until finally they became like this. All life evolved from the primal chaos, and the original laws are the foundation of all life in this universe. Zen's eyes started to glow like tiny balls of fire. The vitality of heaven and earth could be harnessed by martial artists that cultivated the life vitality system. According to this theory, these highly condensed law power already had the properties of chaotic energy. And now, Zen was the first to learn the primal chaos technique. Could he master the law storm? As he thought of this, Zen no longer hesitated. He chanted the spells of the primal chaos technique in his heart and began to trigger the condensed law storm. Zen's master had placed the chaotic energy in Zen's elixir field, and then Zen slowly refined it. At the moment, however, Zen didn't use the chaotic energy within his body. Instead, like a martial artist cultivating the life vitality system, he used the primal chaos technique to make the law storm swirl in reverse, controlling it like the vitality between heaven and earth. Even his master hadn't expected such an outcome. After all, the chaotic energy in the universe was very little to know. Fortunately, Zen wasn't inflexible. As a warrior, he loved exploring new things. More importantly, even his master himself did not cultivate the primal chaos technique. Since Zen had chosen to be a practitioner, he could only comprehend it, study it, and improve on his own. 3 seconds later, his body started to emit an invisible force, wrapping his body. A smirk appeared on his face as he sat there and closed his eyes. The lost storm in front of him seemed to be affected by the force and started to swirl in 2 opposite directions. The gray lost storm was constantly swirling, but at a slow speed. It was spinning slightly unnaturally due to the influence of Zen's primal chaos technique, but the Lord of Sunset World outside the enchanted barrier tower, Yolanda and the other heads of the palaces did not notice anything amiss. Soon, someone shouted, "Finally this guy has stood up. Does he plan to leave the enchanted barrier tower or continue to move forward?" It looks like he's starting to move forward. He's actually walking with his legs. He's finally flying. He is still very slow. He is accelerating. Wow, he is moving really fast. But, he still hasn't used his life vitality. It seems like he isn't using any secret techniques. So how can he be so fast? Oh goodness. The practitioners, on one side of the plaza, who had been complaining non-stop before, were now clamoring again. Of course, this time they weren't complaining about Zen's delay, but rather they were amazed at his speed. Zen was advancing even faster than Layla from before. The heads of palaces, at this moment, had very interesting expressions on their faces. The Lord of Sunset World was looking at Zen attentively. Zen knew why Layla was able to travel 28,000 miles at such a high speed. She did so by opening the wrath of the ocean. However, Zen was relying only on his own strength. Despite his vast knowledge and experience, the Lord of Sunset World was unable to figure out how he did it. Zen seems to be even more powerful than Layla, one of the heads of the palaces exclaimed, mouth agape in astonishment. That seems to be the case, but he still hasn't covered 20,000 miles. I don't think he will be able to break Layla's record, argued another palace leader. Yolanda remained indifferent just as she was before, but the corners of her mouth curved into a faint smile. The surprise in Layla's eyes was undeniable as she stood on the top floor. However, after she pursed her lips, she faintly said to herself, "I know you won't stop at 18,000 miles, otherwise you wouldn't be fit to be my rival. But to go beyond 28,000 miles is impossible." Chapter 1063, Break the Record. Zen didn't really absorb the lost storm into his body. It could be because of the high degree of concentration of the lost storm that it had the elementary form of chaotic energy. It seemed that there was some sort of restoration taking place in the enchanted barrier tower. However, the lost storm was not chaotic energy, and it wouldn't be good for Zen if he absorbed it into his elixir field. Nonetheless, Zen was satisfied that he could make use of the lost storm. He was aware that the lost storm couldn't obstruct him anymore. It was as if he was flying in the outside world. He felt rather relaxed. As Zen increased his speed, he flew forward like a bat out of torture. Thus, the palace leaders became more and more surprised. In an instant, Zen had passed 19,000 miles. And then, 20,000 miles. 21,000 miles. 22,000 miles. Zen did not stop and continued onward at full speed. This is so amazing. He is like flying in the outside world. What secret method is this guy using? He must be cheating. Javier was still healing himself at the corner of the plaza. A bitter smile cracked his lips after he witnessed the performance of Layla and Zen. Darn, I was so naive. I wanted to prove myself so bad and be the number one in passing the torch. Why didn't I think of how impossible that was with Layla and Zen around? I'm far behind to either of them, he thought. Meanwhile, Layla could no longer stay calm. Her heart pounded and her hands clenched into fists. Her fingertips were beginning to turn pale due to the amount of strength she was using. Thus, her blood couldn't flow to her fingertips anymore. He passed 23,000 miles. Will he continue? Uttered Layla to herself while looking sideways at Zen. She really wanted to call for a halt. She wanted Zen to stop. Stop moving. Stop moving. She kept yelling inside her head. However, Zen just kept moving forward. 23,000 miles. 24,000 miles. 25,000 miles. He has already passed 23,000 miles. The Lord of Sunset World clapped his hands and laughed. Amazing. Truly amazing. I missed his performance earlier. I didn't expect this guy to be capable of doing something like this. Well, it looks like you are going to suffer a great loss, joked Yolanda with a smile. As a reply, the World Lord laughed. I have always been generous to the juniors. Since I've promised, I won't go back on my word. Yolanda suddenly thought of something at that time. Thus, she flashed a smile and asked, there is a reward for passing 20,000 miles. I wonder if there's another reward for passing 30,000 miles. Surprise showed on the World Lord's face. On the other hand, all other palace leaders looked at them too with a strange expression on their faces. 30,000 miles. Yolanda, you must be kidding, exclaimed one of the palace leaders while shaking his head. Still laughing, the World Lord said, it's not like you don't know why Layla gave up just now upon reaching 28,000 miles, Yolanda. Yolanda nodded. I know. After reaching 28,000 miles, the warriors will enter the inner circle of the law storm. I also know that the law power within it hasn't been completely shattered. It's a forbidden area for a warrior like Zen. Now do you still have the confidence that Zen can pass 30,000 miles? Mocked another palace leader. Zen was still continuing his journey by that time. It was indeed a stunning performance, but to pass 30,000 miles still seemed impossible for a warrior like him. Thus, nobody believed Yolanda. Where are you getting your confidence? Asked another palace leader. Yolanda just smiled at the palace leader and didn't even seem to care about his doubts. To be honest, she wasn't that confident that Zen could pass 30,000 miles either. But then, it had been common for Zen to surprise her with what he could do. That was the reason that she felt confident that time. I'm actually not as confident as you all think, but I think that a miracle is about to happen now, she voiced out. Impossible, a palace leader said resolutely. Yolanda glared at that palace leader angrily and spat, I'm not talking to you. Amused by her reaction, the World Lord laughed and said, well, since Yolanda brought it up, I have to do something. Okay, if this kid passes 30,000 miles, then it will be just natural for me to give him a big reward. It was only after Yolanda heard that promise that her face beamed with happiness. Layla, who happened to be standing at the side, heard their conversation. She was secretly fuming inside, though her face remained expressionless. 30,000 miles. He hasn't even broken the 28,000-mile record I set yet. How could they talk like they were sure he'll break my record? That's absurd. She thought amid the growing worry in her heart. The momentum of Zen's sprint was definitely not any weaker than hers. Actually, it was even fiercer and faster than hers. How is this possible? I've even activated the wrath of the ocean. However, Zen hasn't even used his life vitality to protect his body yet. He's just relying on his own physical strength to travel more than 20,000 miles. What is going on? Her mind asked. Irritated by her own thoughts, Layla arrogantly cocked her head to the side. She was under the impression that she was the most talented warrior in the universe. Thus, she had always looked down at everyone since entering the Mist Palace. None of the warriors from the 13 palaces could compare to her, and never had she expected to encounter a threat to what she believed. However, on her first day in the Mist Palace, she met Zen and felt that he was a threat to her. Although she had been ignoring the mild fear he was stirring inside her, her worry of losing against him just kept on growing stronger and stronger. Looking back at where Zen was, she finally understood why her heart was beating anxiously. Sadness and dejection flooded her in an instant, making her oblivious of the loud noise that suddenly filled the square. 26,000 miles. Zen will definitely surpass Layla. There shouldn't be much of a problem for Zen in surpassing Layla. 27,000 miles. 28,000 miles. He'll break Layla's record after covering another 200 miles. Layla's beautiful face turned pale. Her perfectly manicured nails dug her flesh when she clenched her hands into fists. 200 miles. It would only take a couple of seconds for Zen to cover that with his speed. He will break my record for sure. Raged her thoughts. Regret was eating her inside out fast. She would have fought harder if she had known how capable Zen was earlier. Even if she might have injured herself, she would have fought for a longer period of time. She could have done it. She took a deep breath to calm herself down. She was wrong when she left the enchanted barrier tower safely. She was too confident that Zen wouldn't be able to catch up to her at the distance she set. It was only now that she realized how naive she had been to think of that. She was still drowning in her regret when Zen passed 200 miles and officially broke her record. Originally, many warriors thought that Layla's record was unprecedented and unbreakable. Nobody expected for her record to be broken in this grand era. However, the shocking reality was now screaming at their faces. It was as if Layla's record wasn't terrifying and suffocating enough that Zen easily broke it. Layla's record only lasted for a few hours. Will Zen continue moving forward? Can he pass 29,000 miles? The space after 28,000 miles is already the inner circle of the law storm. The difficulty isn't the same as how it was in the outer circle. Thus, Layla chose to leave the space 200 miles after she reached 28,000. I believe that Zen will give up now that he has broken Layla's record. The audience all thought that Zen would be leaving the enchanted barrier tower now since there was no one competing with him anymore. He had already taken the first place, and it would be of little significance for him to still advance. However, they were wrong. This was because Zen wasn't thinking of surpassing anyone and had only been following his own will to move forward since he started. The only person he wanted to challenge wasn't anyone else but himself. Thus, he didn't stop and continued charging forward. We won't be able to observe him any longer once he enters the inner circle, a palace leader said while staring at the dark gray lost storm. But we can still feel his position. He has already reached 29,000 miles, the World Lord said with a helpless smile. He now realized that Zen's goal was to pass 30,000 miles. At that time, one of the palace leaders said, at around 29,000 mile mark, I remember that there is a flame pool. There is the immortal profound flame left by Supreme Lord of Profound Flame. Even after all these years, the flame pool still hasn't been completely absorbed by the lost storm. I don't think Zen would cross that flame pool. Chapter 1064, The Flame Pool. After Zen entered the inner circle of the lost storm, no one could see him, but they could still feel his position and deduce how many miles he had covered. This was truly becoming an interesting spectacle to observe, and the palace leaders all followed Zen's progress with bated breaths. The palace leaders were all extremely familiar with the enchanted barrier tower. When that palace leader had mentioned the flame pool earlier, the other leaders immediately understood what he was talking about. The flame pool was located at the 29,800 mile mark. This was where the immortal profound flame had been left by Supreme Lord of Profound Flame. In the chaotic war among several Supreme Lords many years ago, the law power that they had used had nearly torn the entire Orange Sea world apart. The remnant might of the law power reverberated throughout the entire Supreme World, turning the Orange Sea world into a dead world. In the end, the Alliance took a fancy to the Orange Sea world and used the remaining land as a training ground, while they named it Passing the Torch. The Alliance had made the best use of the Orange Sea world's remains. The remaining law power had slowly evolved, disintegrating into various law fragments, and then finally intertwined together to form this massive law storm. However, not all of the Supreme Lords' remaining law power had disintegrated. Some of it still lingered in the Orange Sea world. The skills of some of the Supreme Lords were able to transcend both space and time, such as the immortal profound flame. Even though it had endured for countless years and was engulfed by the lost storm, the immortal profound flame still maintained its exuberant state, burning fiercely within the enchanted barrier tower. It wasn't that the immortal profound flame hadn't been disintegrated at all, but rather that it had also been disintegrated into a considerable amount of fire law fragments. And these fire law fragments had also fused with the lost storm. But even after so many years, when some of the palace leaders entered to investigate, they discovered that the flame pool still contained much danger. The flame pool would not have been worth mentioning to the palace leaders, but it was still something left behind by a Supreme Lord. For warriors at the Life and Death realm or the Soul Sea realm, it was like mad. Zen was going to face an obstacle the likes of which he had never dealt with before. Yolanda, the other palace leaders and the Lord of the Sunset World were well aware of it. That was why that palace leader had firmly told Yolanda that it was simply impossible for Zen to reach 30,000 miles. This was equivalent to letting a newborn child walk into a blazing fire. But Yolanda confidently said that this child would be able to do so. This was a very laughable hypothesis. 29,600 miles. 29,700 miles. 29,800 miles. No one could see Zen's figure, but they could all feel that he had stopped. At the distance of 29,800 miles, he had stopped. I've already said it before. Zen won't be able to pass it. Even if the immortal profound flame only has 1 in 100,000 of its original power, he will still not be able to pass it. I think this kid is probably busy worrying about the flame pool. Actually, 29,800 miles is far enough. I can guarantee that there will be no one who will be able to break the record anytime soon. Not a single one. Zen has already won. These palace leaders weren't despising Zen, but they were rather relying on their own common sense to make a correct estimation and evaluation of him. Yolanda didn't say anything. There was no point in arguing. The key was that she wasn't sure, and was even slightly worried. She had been to the flame pool formed by the immortal profound flame before. It was naturally nothing for her. However, with Zen's cultivation level, no matter how hard he tried, it would be difficult for him to pass. She was afraid that Zen was too stubborn. Even though he clearly knew that his strength was insufficient, he still wanted to pass the flame pool. If he was seriously injured or even died in the flame pool, that would be such a tragic loss. Zen was a man who couldn't be told his fate, but that did not mean that he would not die. It was just that no one would be able to deduce his fate. His life was a mystery. He had defied all the odds in his progress as a warrior, and was not someone who could be placed into a box. He was continuously redefining himself. As for the warriors at the side of the plaza, although they couldn't see Zen's movements, the discussion had become even more intense now. Zen must pass 30,000 miles. He has already reached 29,000 miles. It will be such a travesty if he doesn't manage to make it through. You guys know nothing. There's a flame pool there. Have you heard of it? A few years ago, there were still people who investigated the remaining power left behind by Supreme Lord of Profound Flame. It is said that even if a Spirit Supreme Realm warrior were to touch the flame, he would still be burnt to ashes. What do you think Zen is made of? Are you planning to let him swim through the flame pool? They argued with each other intensely, as if the warrior in the enchanted barrier tower weren't Zen, but themselves. After all, they knew they would by no means be able to compete with Zen. They were not even able to compare themselves to him. Therefore, there were some more objective points of view when they discussed about it. Layla, on the other hand, was sitting in a corner with her mouth pursed, looking like a wronged little girl. No one knew what was on her mind. At this moment, Zen was indeed standing next to a huge flame pool. Although it was called a pool, the truth was that the flame pool was 200 miles long. It was already comparable to some of the large lakes of many great worlds. Within this flame pool, purple flames soared into the sky and directly cut open the surrounding law storm. They reached the dome of the enchanted barrier tower, blocking Zen's path forward. The air crackled with the lively energy present at the scene. I'm completely unable to comprehend the law power within these flames. This fire law is at least beyond the 5th layer, Zen muttered to himself. Zen understood that the fire law definitely wasn't limited to just the 5th layer. After all, the law storm was the remaining might of Supreme Lords. And, the layer of laws comprehended by Supreme Lords was not something that Zen could easily imagine. There seems to be a trace of life law within these flames. This is really amazing, Zen exclaimed in excitement at the discovery. The fire law represented annihilation, and was contrary to the life law. With these two laws fused together, it was easy to imagine just how difficult it was to create such flames. Zen was able to control the compressed law storm to a certain extent, but he was unable to control the flames in the pool. However, he had already begun to formulate a plan in his mind. The warriors outside the enchanted barrier tower had spoken correctly, and Zen was planning to swim over. After Zen's body was forged into a sacred weapon by raging fire, he was no longer able to find some suitable fire to temper his body further. To him, the flame pool before him was not a crisis but a lucky chance. He always relished the chance to prove himself and reach a new level. Perhaps, he would be able to improve his physical body once again with the flame pool and make his body into a divine weapon. If his physical body became stronger, the amount of dragon scales he would be able to bear would also increase by a level. It would clearly have obvious benefits for his strength development. However, Zen felt some hesitation when he stopped in front of the flame pool. The flame pool was something left behind by a Supreme Lord. Perhaps the remaining might within it had weakened countless times over the years, but the purple flames still made Zen feel a brief tingling of fear. There was something ominous and threatening about the purple flames. Would his sacred weapon body be able to withstand the burning of these purple flames? Was he overestimating his skills? Would he soon face the music? Warriors were all endowed with a certain elevated sense of self, and though this was one of their best assets, it could also be their downfall. Previously, Zen had also understood that with his sacred weapon body, he didn't seem to be afraid of any flames. However, this time, the flames he encountered were completely different. And clearly more deadly. If he did not succeed and died here, it would be a tragedy. To have come so far and then fail was a tragedy which he could not allow. Thinking of this, Zen slowly walked to the edge of the flame pool. The closer he got, the more he could feel the fierce heat blowing against his face. Great, shimmering heat waves drifted lazily across the air. When he was still about 100 feet away, his clothing burst into flames and then turned into a pile of white ashes, scattering from his body. Flexing his powerful body, Zen struggled on. These are the most powerful flames among all of the flames that I have ever come in contact with, he murmured appreciatively. Zen was both vigilant and hopeful in the face of the roaring flames. He knew that he was taking a risk, but there were some dangers that he had no choice but to face. His honor demanded it, and he didn't back down from a challenge. He slowly walked to the edge of the flame pool and stared at the violent flames as he extended his hand into the flame pool. Chapter 1065, The Divine Flame World. To be safe, Zen only stretched out one hand. If these flames could really incinerate his body, then he would be able to retreat in time. Losing one arm was better than losing his entire body. Zen was being naive, though. The moment he touched the purple flames, they spread from his arm throughout his body at a speed that far exceeded his imagination. There was no time for him to react at all. The scorching heat from the flames poured directly into his body, spreading to every bone and every organ. This is bad. Zen's face darkened. He hadn't thought that these purple flames would be so powerful. He gritted his teeth while bearing the scorching heat of the purple flames. As for whether or not he would succeed, it was up to the heavens. Zen had been tempered by flames before, but this time his body reacted way faster and much more violently. Under the burning of the flames, his body turned red, as if he was a statue that was melting into molten steel. At the same time, golden vortexes appeared on the surface of his body and started to spin quickly. When the golden vortexes began to absorb the purple flames, Zen started to feel relieved. Although Zen felt confident, he couldn't help but worry that the flames left behind by the Supreme Lord were too powerful. It was true that his physical body was comparable to a sacred weapon, but these flames were impressive. He knew that if he were to throw a sacred weapon into the fire, it would instantly turn into molten metal. Zen never thought that these flames would be so fierce. He felt relieved that his body reacted incredibly fast, or he wouldn't have been able to withstand the heat. Now that he had already absorbed some of the purple flames, he decided to wait before crossing the flame pool until his body had settled. As the dense golden vortexes were crazily absorbing the purple flames, he soon found out that there was something wrong. The golden vortexes were absorbing the flames too fast, just like a starving boy wolfing down his food. Each time the golden vortexes were activated, they would be able to completely absorb the flames within a short period of time. They were just like vicious beasts that had starved for 1,000 years, and were extremely greedy for the flames. Now, even though his body had been absorbing the flames for so long, the purple flames on his body would not disappear. They kept on burning even more brilliantly, making Zen shine. From a distance, Zen looked like a burning pillar of fire. A long tower of fire soared up above his head, charging straight to the top of the enchanted barrier tower. These purple flames keep coming. It seems like I will never be able to absorb all of them. Zen placed his hands in front of his chest and looked at the purple flames that continuously coiled around him. A worried and cautious expression appeared on his face. This is the immortal profound flame left by the Supreme Lord of Profound Flame. It will not be easy to extinguish it, Lavender said calmly. The immortal profound flame? Asked Zen. Yes, the immortal profound flame has a great history. It wasn't created by the Supreme Lord of Profound Flame himself, but came from the Divine Flame World, Lavender continued. The Divine Flame World? Zen was caught by surprise. He had never heard of this Supreme World. However, he hadn't been in the upper world for long, so there was no way he could know everything about it. The Divine Flame World was an independent Supreme World within the universe. The special thing about this Supreme World was that it was filled with all sorts of blazing fires. It was not suitable for living beings to live in, and only a few fire-resistant or special-shaped creatures could survive here. Truth was, the flames were the indigenous inhabitants of the Divine Flame World. In fact, fires and thunders would all gradually turn into spirits and slowly acquire wisdom. The golden wind blades that Zen had encountered before in the storms of the chaotic ocean of stars also possessed their own intelligence. On the other hand, the immortal profound flame was extremely rare to find in the enormous Divine Flame World. Back then, in order to obtain this flame, the Supreme Lord of Profound Flame had personally entered the Divine Flame World. It had taken him dozens of years before he could capture a single wisp of it. He had nurtured it carefully afterwards, until it eventually became strong and vast. The most important characteristic of the immortal profound flame was that it could never extinguish. Most of the power left behind by the Supreme Lords in the Lost Storm had gradually disintegrated into law fragments. Yet, the immortal profound flame was still burning fiercely. Even though it was much weaker than it had been back then, it still burned brightly. Zen became anxious when he heard that the fire couldn't be extinguished. But, if the immortal profound flame can't be extinguished, will it always be burning on my body? Will this ever end? Asked Zen. The immortal profound flame can burn on your body for tens of thousands of years. Walking around with this flame on your body for tens of thousands of years is indeed very eye-catching. Lavender laughed. It seemed that as a sacred weapon, Zen's physique could withstand the burning of the immortal profound flame. After absorbing the immortal fire, it was very likely that his body would become even stronger and complete a new round of transformation. The problem was that the flames couldn't be extinguished. Would Zen really have to walk around with the flames burning on him? He wouldn't even be able to wear clothes. Moreover, he always carried with him his spirit beast bag, space ring, and other personal belonging, which now had been put somewhere near him. If he couldn't extinguish the immortal profound flame, he wouldn't be able to take those things with him. The space ring that Letitia had given him wasn't of a high grade. If it was burned by the immortal profound flame, it would melt instantly. Now, Zen was stumped. However, he suddenly felt that something was amiss. He realized that Lavender's tone was extremely relaxed. She supported Zen. As she already knew about the characteristics of the immortal profound flame, she should have spoken up to stop him when he was trying to refine his body with the immortal profound flame. However, she didn't say a word, and her tone right now was very casual. It looked like she already knew a way to solve the problem. All right, stop teasing him. Zen, you forgot about the ancestral dragon. Although it is still in its infancy and has no fighting power, it possesses some abilities that you can make use of, the cyan dragon said slowly. The ancestral dragon? Zen was slightly surprised. The baby dragon was still in Zen's spirit beast bag. However, ever since Zen had ascended to the upper world, it had been sleeping a lot. When he was in the Mist Palace, Zen would let it roam around, but the little guy did not seem to be interested in him. Every time it was out of the bag, it would look for Margaret. The ancestral dragon loved her food, so it kept following her. And even though it wouldn't help it grow, it really liked the flavor of her food. When the cyan dragon brought the ancestral dragon up, Zen realized that the ancestral dragon seemed to be able to ignore all laws. When he was in the heavenly stellar secret land, Zen had been unable to take out the ancestral dragon egg. The ancestral dragon had been able to easily ignore the limit of the spatial refraction. However, Zen and the Spirit Supreme Realm warriors of celestial position couldn't enter the refracted space. The ancestral dragon. A light flashed through Zen's eyes as he looked at the spirit beast bag. But he didn't reach out to take the spirit beast bag. He lightly flicked his fingers towards the bag from a distance and, in a flash, the baby dragon dashed straight towards him and pounced into his arms. The little guy had spent most of its time in Zen's spirit beast bag. Although the interior space of the spirit beast bag was big, it still felt stuffy and had to run outside to take a stroll. It simply jumped onto Zen's body, ignoring the immortal profound flame just like it had ignored the spatial refraction before. The immortal profound flame indeed did not cause any harm to the ancestral dragon. This little guy is immune to all original laws. Zen held out his hands in front of the ancestral dragon. The purple flames on his hands continued to burn, without any sign of weakening. When the ancestral dragon saw this, it opened its small mouth and swallowed the flames burning on Zen's hands. Before long, Zen began flying across the flame pool. He would still catch the immortal profound flame while flying, and he did not let the ancestral dragon clean the flames on his body. He wanted to wait until after he had covered these 200 miles. Just then, the warriors outside the enchanted barrier tower discovered that Zen had once again advanced. Chapter 1066, 36,000 miles. This brat, he dared to break into the flame pool. Anyone who touches the immortal profound flame is doomed to be burned into ashes. Is this kid not afraid of death? Zen had stood in front of the pool for quite a while and all the leaders thought he would eventually give up and turn away. However, one could imagine their shock when he actually went and jumped into the pool. The immortal profound flame was an inextinguishable fire that would never cease to glow. If one valued their life, then one would choose to steer clear of it, and it would be a blind faith if one chose to continue moving forward. All these leaders had extensive knowledge and experience of the world while their strength could be considered close to the level of world lords. But despite their wisdom, it seemed they could still be surprised. "Sir, shouldn't we bring that kid back?" one of the leaders asked the Sunset World Lord. The World Lord pondered for a moment. It would be quite a pity if such an extraordinary warrior like Zen died in the enchanted barrier tower. Layla was definitely set to be admitted to the Spring Fragrance Pavilion. Zen, on the other hand, would probably be sent to the Gauze Pavilion. There was no way the Sunset World Lord could allow this young man to die. He suddenly stood up and prepared to go after him. A World Lord's stride could cross tens of thousands of miles in just a blink of an eye. However, a gentle voice froze him in place. "Sir, please wait." The sound of Yolanda's voice caused a strange expression to appear on the Sunset World Lord's face. Oh. What is it? There's no need to bring Zen out. He won't perish, she told him. She had initially been worried about Zen and also thought conclusions of these leaders were indeed reasonable, and she could also predict what would happen if Zen stepped into the flame pool. However, after thinking more about it, she realized that Zen was not someone who would do something so recklessly. Since he had chosen to move forward, then he probably knew what he was doing. There was no need to worry about him. These leaders' worries were reasonable and not unfounded, but Zen had proven time and again that he wasn't someone that could be judged by common standards. The Sunset World Lord stood his ground after hearing Yolanda's words. He stood back and looked towards the place where the young man had vanished. He too wanted to see if Zen would make it. With this, the many leaders' worries abated, especially when they saw what happened to him next. Within the flame pool, they witnessed that Zen was moving forward at a fast pace. The entire flame pool was only 200 miles wide. His speed wasn't slow, so it wouldn't take too much time for him to pass through it. In fact, after 5 minutes, one of the leaders could only mumble in a daze, "He has passed it. He's already traveled 30,000 miles. This kid's speed has increased once again. 30,500 miles. Everyone fell silent, including the leaders and the warriors at the side of the square. Even Layla was at a loss for words. She remembered her master telling her that she would be the main character, nay, the star of this era. But what was this? Why did someone such as Zen suddenly come and make her pale in comparison? She dazedly pulled the blue butterfly ornament off her hair and kneaded it in her hand. This ornament was incredibly vivid and was also a second-rank divine weapon of supporting functions. The blue butterfly also had its own special origin. Layla always wore this ornament above her right ear. During times of extreme frustration, she would often take off an accessory from her body and knead it in her hand. Cracks suddenly began to appear as she continued kneading the second-rank divine weapon. Not long after, a small, shattering sound snapped her out of her reverie. Layla looked down at her hand and found that the butterfly wings had crumbled and broke in two. Then the whole ornament became numerous pieces in her hand. A second-rank divine weapon was invaluable and destroying one was not an easy feat. She had obviously used her life vitality to destroy it, causing it to shatter. It was only when the ornament had been reduced to dust that she raised her head. Her eyes flashed with a strong aura. "I won't lose. Not to someone like you, Zen Luo," she muttered. She could accept her loss at this time in the enchanted barrier tower, but there were other tests to be accomplished in passing the torch. She did not feel discouraged despite this setback. However, the price to set her mood back on track was high. The fine dust of the former second-rank divine weapon was proof of her rage, but it served to further strengthen her conviction. Compared to those talents who lost and were unable to recover from the heavy blow, Layla's warrior spirit was relatively strong. Amidst everyone's silence, Zen continued to break through. 31,000 miles, 32,000 miles, 33,000 miles. There was no limit to how far he could go. Nobody could predict when he would stop. It wasn't until he reached 36,000 miles that he halted. And only because there was a lightning waterfall in front of him. The lightning contained the power of the water law, which resulted in its peculiar, waterfall-like movement. The intense power of thunder and lightning collided and emitted a dazzling light. This electric waterfall exuded a far more intense power than the previous flame pool he jumped into before. There was no doubt that this was also another masterpiece, created by some supreme lord. Zen simply stood in front of this waterfall. He probably had a chance to cross it, but was there really a need to take that risk? Sure, it was important to test one's limits, but there was a fine line that must be drawn between guts and reckless stupidity. He could die if he wasn't careful. The only reason he was so confident to cross the flame pool earlier was because his body was immune to the attack of the fire law. All he needed to do then was to grit his teeth and run. However, the power of thunder and lightning was another story. Thus, Zen summoned the ancestral dragon and let it devour the immortal profound flame that was on him. After he passed through the flame pool, Zen hadn't put the ancestral dragon back into the spirit beast bag, but instead had it accompany him along the way. The little dragon seemed unaffected by the law power and was able to fly freely in the storm. Meanwhile, Zen used the immortal profound flame to temper his physical body, not really in any hurry to extinguish the flame after passing through the flame pool. Since the golden vortexes were absorbing the immortal profound flame unceasingly, he would just let them be. Numerous golden vortexes began to close up, absorbing the immortal profound flame. Zen had to get rid of it now because Lavender had reminded him that he would walk out of here with the ball of immortal profound flame on him. But he didn't think it would be acceptable if others saw him like this. After the ancestral dragon completely devoured the immortal profound flame, it burped loudly, indicating that it had eaten its fill. Zen then stretched his hand out towards the little dragon. With a snort, the ancestral dragon obediently went towards him and Zen stuffed it inside the spirit beast bag. His actions seemed to have displeased it as the little dragon moved wildly for a little bit before finally becoming still. With the extinguished immortal profound flame, Zen's molten red body finally began to cool down. His tempered physique had once again risen another level, though he couldn't be too sure what rank he had reached since he didn't see any evidence of divine textures on his chest. He could only figure it out in the future. However, his strength still increased greatly. To test this out, Zen began to condense the power of the dragon scales. The surging power quickly rushed into his body. 1,000 dragon scales. 3,000 dragon scales. 5,000 dragon scales. 10,000 dragon scales. 15,000 dragon scales. He had already activated all the dragon scales that had been lit up, but he felt nothing different in his body. All he could feel was the raw power surging through his veins. He clenched his fist and marveled at how such a small action could release such a huge force that actually distorted the surrounded space. It seemed that he would need to collect more heavenly essence. Chapter 1067, The Cold Plum Blood Spear. Gathering the heavenly essence was not a difficult task for Zen. In the past, he was restricted by his own sacred weapon body, but now that he was more powerful, he was no longer stopped by it. His physical body had already become a divine weapon. Although he didn't know what grade of weapon it was, it would definitely be able to contain more than 10,000 dragon scales. Thinking of this, Zen suddenly patted his head in self-assurance. Would his body become a supreme divine weapon if it continued to gain more power? I've heard that the universe spirit tablet is very special. Although the law of causality contained within it is useless in battle, it could detect all the magic weapons in the universe, he thought. If his physical body became so strong, would his name also appear on the universe spirit tablet? Impressive as it was, Zen did not consider this a good thing for himself. He didn't want his special physique to be exposed to others. Hence he voiced his concern. Both Lavender and the Cyan Dragon passed their judgment at the same time, believing that it was indeed possible for his name to appear on the universe spirit tablet. His current physical body appeared to be made of flesh and blood, but his essence had already been changed by the divine flame cauldron. In many ways, his body had the characteristics of a weapon. One might say that he was half human and half weapon. This sort of situation had never taken place in the universe before. Lavender and the Cyan Dragon thought it might be possible, but they were not 100% certain that his name would really appear on the spirit tablet. When Zen stopped in front of the lightning waterfall, the world lord of the sunset world, Yolanda and other palace leaders thought he was about to cross it. Even Yolanda was starting to get nervous. If Zen really did cross it, she would personally go in the waterfall and bring him out. However, after reaching 36,000 miles, Zen paused for a moment and changed his mind. Then, he suddenly appeared at the entrance of the enchanted barrier tower. At this moment, Zen's physical body upgraded to another level as he got burnt by the profound flame. His clothes were charred, so he took out a spare set of white clothes and put them on. He looked vivacious and extraordinary. Many warriors who had returned from the enchanted barrier tower were either injured or covered in dirt. Zen had traveled 36,000 miles, going twice as far as Supreme Lord Illusion and 8,000 miles farther than Layla. It was not hard for the warriors of the 13 palaces to imagine the danger involved in this journey. But Zen looked perfectly fine, as if he had just returned from a vacation. Many warriors were speechless and surprised, while some were indignant. The gap between them and Zen was just too large. They began to wonder if he had cheated in the enchanted barrier tower. However, with so many palace leaders and the world lord watching, it was close to impossible to cheat. The truth was that they only accused him falsely in their minds to make themselves feel better. Zen, come up, Yolanda said gracefully. He nodded, and with a stomp of his foot, he flew to the top of the building and his eyes met Layla's. If he had come out a little earlier, Layla would have glared at him. However, she had managed to compose herself, so she sportingly said, "Congratulations." He nodded slightly in acknowledgement and turned to look at Yolanda. Layla, however, continued to study him, thinking to herself, "I believe I can get another chance to defeat you." Yolanda smiled faintly at Zen. "I don't think that anyone can ace your score in the future. You didn't disappoint me. Congratulations." "Thank you," he said with a smile. Yolanda looked at the Sunset World Lord beside her and introduced him to Zen. "This is the Lord of Sunset World." He has promised that there would be rewards for breaking 20,000 miles and 30,000 miles. There are rewards, too? Asked Zen with his heart racing. He had heard that there were rewards for traveling 1,000 miles, 3,000 miles and 10,000 miles. He wasn't aware of any other rewards. He tried his best to travel 36,000 miles without even knowing that there was a reward for him at the finish line. However, if the world lord of a supreme world was offering him a reward, he would definitely accept it. The Lord of Sunset World had made a promise in front of everyone, so he naturally wouldn't go back on his words. The world lord gazed at Zen before smiling lightly. Young man, I have been forced by Yolanda to provide the reward of reaching 30,000 miles. So I've decided to give you these rewards. As for the reward of traveling 20,000 miles, what do you want? What do I want? Zen's gaze flickered slightly, and he already had something in mind. Spear, I want a spear, he demanded excitedly. A spear? Layla, who was at the side, couldn't help but ask incredulously, what do you want a spear for? Aren't you adept at using a sword? Can you even use a spear? He actually wanted the spear for Lavender. Now the sword spirit had strengthened and more than half of Lavender's soul had also recovered, but she didn't have a proper weapon to use. Zen had wanted to enter the weapon house to help Lavender choose a spear, but he didn't get the chance as he didn't have enough life vitality jades. Yolanda, of course, understood this. The Demon Knight's Queen of Killings usually used a spear, and Zen was trying to help Lavender. He had found the right person to ask for this weapon. Ha, the Lord of Sunset World chortled. Zen looked at him curiously. The World Lord of the Sunset World said, what a coincidence. My usual weapon of choice is also a spear. Then several rays of light shot out behind the Lord of Sunset World, and floated out in front of Zen. You can choose any one of these 4 spears, the Lord of Sunset World said, with a smug expression on his face. Since the World Lord's preferred weapon was a spear, he naturally possessed many good spears. The 4 spears floating in front of Zen were with different colors and lengths, and each of them had varied levels of power, but they were all extraordinary. When Yolanda saw the 4 spears, she smiled at the World Lord and remarked, I believe you might have more than 4 good spears. The Lord of the Sunset World smiled. Indeed, these 4 spears can all be listed on the Universe Spirit Tablet. However, I still have 2 first-rank divine weapons, and they can be ranked in the top 4,000 on the Universe Spirit Tablet. They are only second to the Supreme Divine Weapons. If Zen picks one of the 2 first-rank weapons right now, I'm afraid I will have no other powerful weapons to give him as the reward for reaching 30,000 miles. A first-rank divine weapon that ranked in the top 4,000 was considered a remarkable divine weapon. The top 3,000 weapons on the Universe Spirit Tablet were all Supreme Divine Weapons. Yolanda said to Zen, if you choose the first-rank spear, the Lord of the Sunset World will give it to you now, but he will not give you any other reward. That means you can only get 1 prize even though you have broken 2 records and are eligible for 2 prizes. Now the ball was in Zen's court. He would have to make a choice. Lavender said flatly, Zen, you don't need to use up 2 rewards for the spear. But Zen was still hesitant. He considered Lavender to be very powerful. If he could help her get an even better spear, he would not think twice about it. He didn't care whether he was sacrificing 1 or 2 rewards for this purpose. Reading his thoughts, Lavender said, no need. I just want the black spear on the right side. Since Lavender was determined not to get the first-rank spear, Zen could no longer insist on it. He nodded to the Lord of the Sunset World and said, there's no need. I want this spear, said Zen pointing at the black spear on the far right. Oh, a look of surprise flashed across the Sunset World Lord's face. You seem to have a really in-depth knowledge of spears. Or is it someone else who gave you this advice? He asked looking in the direction of Yolanda. The 4 spears were ranked at around 9,000 on the Universe Spirit Tablet, and the Cold Plum Blood spear that Zen selected was the best among the 4 options he was given. It currently ranked 9,036th. Every month, the Universe Spirit Tablet would be refreshed and the words written on it would change. The rankings of the weapons also changed constantly, and the lower the grade of the weapon was, the more its rank fluctuated. However, this Cold Plum Blood spear was more prized than the other 3 spears. Zen had chosen it without thinking too much, so the Lord of the Sunset World believed that it was Yolanda who advised him to pick that spear. Yolanda naturally knew that it was Lavender who had asked Zen to choose that spear. She shook her head and said to the Lord of the Sunset World, I have never spoken to Zen through my life vitality. Besides, you can always feel the life vitality fluctuations. Chapter 1068, Challenge. This was the truth. Although the others couldn't hear the life vitality sound transmission, they could still feel it. The Sunset World Lord was very sensitive to life vitality. He was unable to detect any life vitality fluctuations around Yolanda and Zen. The Sunset World Lord nodded and looked impressed. A martial artist's vision was often very important. He stretched out his hand and flicked the cold plum blood spear, and the spear went spinning towards Zen. Zen grabbed the spear and studied it closely. He discovered that there were faint traces of plum blossoms on the shaft of the spear. A trace of chaotic energy emitted from his palm and got absorbed within cold plum blood spear silently. The plum blossoms on the shaft gradually revealed themselves, turning into streaks of blood-red plum blossoms. Under the blood light, they bloomed to become more vivid and glistened, while at the same time, they exuded an aura from remote ages. Since the name of the spear had the word, blood, in it, there must be a story behind it. How is your life vitality so refined? The color of the plum blossoms that is activated is so bright. The Sunset World Lord had a strange expression on his face. With his cultivation as a World Lord, the life vitality he had accumulated was countless times greater than that of a kid at the life and death realm. However, even he was unable to awaken the ancient blood to this extent. So how did Zen do it? It was only possible if Zen also possessed a strand of ancient blood, which was able to interact with the ancient blood within the spear. However, the Sunset World Lord was unable to detect the aura of an ancient bloodline from Zen's body. He was bewildered now. All talents had their own secrets. For example, Zen was able to fly 36,000 miles relying only on his own physical strength. What abilities did he have that allowed him to travel so far? It was a mystery, and the Sunset World Lord didn't intend to probe. The other palace heads also looked at the spear in Zen's hands with a trace of envy in their eyes. The weapons held by the palace heads were somewhat on par with Zen's spear. How could anyone not envy this kid who had obtained such a powerful weapon at this level? Sir, do tell us what is the reward for traveling 30,000 miles? Yolanda cut in again. The Sunset World Lord chuckled in response and said, I will reveal it to Zen when the passing the torch ends. Unlike the Celestial Position's Tower of Crystal, passing the torch was a pure trial, and this trial was divided into two parts. The first part was the Enchanted Barrier Tower, and the second was the Illusion Challenge. Zen and Layla descended from the top floor and returned to the group of martial practitioners. He found a corner and sat down. Layla sat beside him. Many of the martial artists in the 13 palaces now knew why Layla had only allowed Zen to sit beside her when she was meditating on the stone carving. Everyone sighed silently in their hearts. Indeed, among the younger generation, there weren't many who were qualified enough to sit next to Layla. And Zen was one of them. At this moment, the old man in cotton clothes, who was floating in the air, spoke in his aged voice. Warriors of the 13 palaces will enter the illusion space next. The illusion battlefield will be opened soon, and this time, the illusion space trial will be a rehearsal for the illusion battlefield. So everyone, work hard. The old man then led the way, and the martial artists of the 13 palaces stood up and followed him. Layla's face was as calm as still water, but there was uncontrollable excitement in her heart. She had already been defeated in the Enchanted Barrier Tower. She just had to win in the illusion space trial. It was very difficult to make her concede defeat. After confirming her fate, she had to work 10 times harder than other martial artists. She wasn't willing to play just a supporting role in this battle of worlds. Perhaps Zen was an obstacle that the heavens had arranged for her. His sudden appearance in her life was no coincidence, nor was the fact that he was more powerful than her. I will definitely beat you in this battle, she promised herself. Layla's eyes flickered as she looked at Zen. Thanks to her determination, she was unwittingly radiating a decisive aura, causing other warriors to turn to watch her. Zen was the only one who did not turn around. He strutted off in front of Layla, but the corners of his mouth turned up slightly. The illusion space was built within an ancient palace on Willow Island. It was not far from the Enchanted Barrier Tower. Soon, everyone arrived at the venue. Get into groups of 200. Go into the illusion space. The trial begins. After the old man in cotton clothes finished speaking, he took out an amethyst. He casually swiped his finger across the amethyst and drew out the names of 200 martial artists. One by one, golden names appeared above everyone's heads. When the warriors saw their names, they stepped forward and entered the ancient palace. Afterwards they sat down cross-legged. Zen had only entered the illusion space once and knew that once they sat down, their images would appear in the illusion space. He looked at Layla who was sitting beside him. She took the initiative. What do you want to know? Don't tell me you've never entered the illusion space before. She knew that Zen had ascended from the lower world, and that he had only spent a short duration of time in the upper world, so it was very likely that he had never been to the illusion space. Zen shook his head and said, "I've been there once, but what is illusion battlefield?" Layla laughed lightly. "Illusion battlefield will only be open in a few more years." "What happens once it opens?" he inquired. "It's simple. All of the talents in the universe, including the future world lords, successors to supreme lords, and even some of the reclusive talents will participate." Layla added, laughing, "Actually, I've never seen it either. Nor has any of the creatures of this grand era." "What? Nobody has seen it before?" Zen was taken aback. A single grand era was 3.6 billion years, and it was said that when a grand era ended, it would often be accompanied by great extinction. Countless living creatures in the universe would be destroyed during the extinction. Only when the next grand era began would life slowly bloom again. The universe had witnessed many grand eras. It was unknown just how many cycles it had gone through. The end of a grand era would cause even the heavens to collapse. The heavenly fragment Zen had was a fragment of the previous heavens, which had collapsed at the end of the last grand era. Only a small number of supreme experts would be able to survive the last grand era and go on to the next by surviving the extinction period. What's so strange about that? It's said that the illusion battlefield has always opened during the War of the Worlds. Perhaps, it is a prelude to the Chaos Worlds. Layla thought this was common knowledge, but it was necessary to elucidate to Zen. "I understand," he said, nodding. Now, everyone's attention was on the trial in the ancient hall. Under the instructions of the old man, a row of picture slabs were hung up for people to watch the trial in the ancient palace. The 200 people entering the illusion space together were definitely not going to fight with each other at the same time. It was only when the picture slabs were hung up that Zen clearly saw that the warriors had been continuously accepting challenges after entering the illusion space. Soon, martial artists were getting eliminated from the competition. Their projections died in the illusion space. When the original bodies opened their eyes, they dejectedly left the ancient palace. Over time, the challenge became more and more difficult, and more people exited the area. The last person endured a total of 11 rounds before his projection finally perished in the illusion space. When he opened his eyes, he discovered that he was the only person left in the ancient palace. A smug look appeared on his face. When all 200 of them had left the ancient hall, the old man shook his head and said, "Even the one with the best results in this round has only accepted 11 challenges. This is quite disappointing." It was obvious that the old man's opinion of the 200 warriors was not high. He didn't even announce the name of the warrior who took the first place. Chapter 1069, The Peeling Off Words. The second group. The old man dressed in cotton clothes stretched out his hand and once again casually made a mark on the name list, in the end selecting 200 warriors' names. As those names floated out, the warriors, who saw their names, entered the ancient palace. As for the challenges in the illusion space, the vast majority of the warriors were able to hold on for the first 6 rounds. After 6 rounds, the difficulty level increased dramatically. There were more and more warriors expiring then, and once they were vanquished, they would be eliminated from the illusion space. 7 rounds, 8 rounds, 9 rounds, 10 rounds. As the difficulty increased, the number of eliminated warriors also increased. However, there were a few who were more powerful, and displayed eye-catching talents in the second group. For example, the warrior who was surnamed Li lasted for an amazing 19 rounds before he was finally eliminated. This time, the old man in cotton clothes was somewhat satisfied. He said in his customarily dry voice, "Among this group of warriors, Raphael Li has held on for 19 rounds. Not bad." A faint trace of a smile appeared on Raphael Li's impassive face. He then glanced at Zen and Layla, hoping for a reaction on their part. A talent who could enter the 13 palaces was, after all, quite conceited. Before participating in the passing the torch, Raphael Li had been very confident of his own strength. However, in the enchanted barrier tower, he hadn't performed as well as Zen and Layla had. Even though he had thought that it would be very difficult for him to get a first place, he had never expected that the gap between him and these 2 warriors would have become so large. The trial in the illusion space was not a competition of endurance, but a display of the strongest combat power one could wield with skill. However, Raphael didn't know how strong Zen's and Layla's combat powers were. He was secretly concerned that they would be able to beat him in this leg of the contest too. But Raphael Lee tried to soothe his worries by reasoning that Zen was only at the 5th level of the life and death realm, and Layla was just a woman after all. Raphael Lee's mind was filled with distracting thoughts which came with an overinflated ego and distorted sense of self. Naturally, he did not want them to surpass him. The third group. Zen looked at the names floating in the air, but he still couldn't find his own name. Layla was disappointed as she also didn't see her name. She took off one of her heart-shaped earrings and gently kneaded it in her palm. This time, she used too much strength and crushed it within her hand. Though, she hardly noticed, as the heart crumbled under her grip. However, the third group of warriors included Javier from the 13 Palaces. Javier had been severely injured in the Enchanted Barrier Tower. After the treatment he had received just now, he had managed to recover quite a lot. After the 200 warriors entered the ancient palace, they quickly assumed their positions, projecting their figures into the illusion space. As they kept on battling, more and more warriors were eliminated, their projected selves disappearing after being vanquished. Among this group of warriors, Javier was the one with the best performance. If they were ranked according to the results of the Enchanted Barrier Tower, Javier would be ranked as one of the top 3. Although he wasn't as excellent or talented as Zen and Layla, who stole the show, quite a few warriors still thought highly of him. He had impressed the other warriors with his skills and determination. But his result was shocking and disappointing this time. In the end, he was only able to hold out for a mere 17 rounds. Not good enough to beat Raphael's score. Javier was the #1 warrior in the Mist Palace, yet he had only lasted 17 rounds, and his result was rather disappointing. When he left the ancient palace, Javier seemed a bit disheartened. Upon seeing his morose expression, Zen could not help but shake his head in sympathy. Although Javier was persistent, he had bound his success to others and relied on everyone else's support to strengthen his conviction. In the end, he would fail to complete as many things as he could as his foundation was not solid. As for Yolanda, she remained indifferent and showed no reaction to Javier's defeat. The 4th group, the 5th group, the 6th group. They waited for a long time, but Zen's and Layla's names were still not selected or announced. As time passed, Zen was becoming a bit confused. It seemed like the old man dressed in cotton clothes had done it on purpose, and wanted him to be in the last group. Layla would probably be arranged in the same group as him. The lengthy wait was starting to affect their nerves as Zen and Layla waited for their chance to enter the ancient palace. Even though 200 warriors entered the ancient palace each time, the warriors might still need to be divided into over 20 groups, as there were more than 4,000 warriors. So Zen had to wait for a long time before he took his turn in entering the ancient palace. Layla could also roughly guess what was going on, so she did not raise her head to look for her name. As more and more warriors entered the illusion space, some of them achieved amazing results. Some warriors might have only walked about 8,000 miles or even 5,000 miles within the Enchanted Barrier Tower during the previous challenge. But, they had still managed to obtain good results this time. Testing different skills led to great accomplishments. After all, while the warriors had stayed in the Enchanted Barrier Tower, they had just faced the test of endurance and the comprehension of laws. Being a warrior was determined by more than just 2 skills. It was true that their fighting strength was linked to these things, but there were some warriors who simply weren't able to display their full strength in the law storm. In a different environment, these warriors were able to rise to the occasion and achieve greatness. Because of this, the rankings had undergone a dynamic shift. The warriors from some palaces, such as the Coldness Palace and the Gold Palace, obtained good results, and some of them had even held on for 20 rounds. This was an impressive display of martial arts and cultivation. The palace leaders naturally felt proud and elated. The achievements of their subordinates added to their own esteem, after all. However, when their gazes inadvertently landed on Zen and Layla, they started to feel slightly displeased. The final results of the match were hard to determine for now, since Zen and Layla hadn't even taken part in the battle yet. It was still anyone's game. Several hours later, it was finally the last group of warriors' turn to challenge. The last group included 163 warriors, less than the 200 warriors who had numbered the previous groups. The old man didn't even need to call out the remaining warriors, because they already knew that it was their turn now. This was their chance to impress now, and tensions ran high after a whole day of waiting to be called. However, when the old man marked and selected the names for the last group, Zen and Layla were still unable to find their own names. What was going on? Zen was astonished and confused. Layla tilted her head also with a deeply puzzled look on her face. The old man dressed in the cotton clothes hovered in the air, and seemed to have noticed their expressions, so he said, "The 2 of you are in the next group." Is that really necessary? Zen looked morose at that moment. As for the old man, he had a calm expression, as if it was all a matter of course. He was extremely willful and insisted on arranging Zen and Layla in the last group. Finally, the 161 warriors all entered the ancient palace to undergo the test. At this moment, the huge stone on the other side of Willow Island underwent some dramatic changes. After Zen had left, a crack appeared through the words of the huge stone. The cracking progressed with a slow speed, as it ran along the rock face. 2 cracks had also appeared on the other 2 big words 4 hours after Zen had left. However, the cracking speed kept increasing. In these past 2 days, countless cracks had appeared on the big words written by Supreme Lord Sword. During the last 2 days and 2 nights, the 2 Spirit Supreme Realm warriors, Landry and Damien, had also kept their eyes on everything that was happening in front of them. After they had already spent tens of thousands of years there, 2 days and 2 nights were not a long time in their eyes. However, now they felt that these 2 days and 2 nights seemed to be as long as 1,000 years. Time was always a relative concept. They didn't know what Zen had done, but at the very least, he had somehow managed to trigger the huge words left behind by Supreme Lord Sword. This meant that the secret left behind by Supreme Lord Sword would very likely be unraveled after so many years' mystery. It was very likely that the greatly anticipated mystery did not even exist. The result might indeed bring the fatal blow to Damien and Landry, and they might even pass away on the spot. However, if the mystery existed and was unraveled, they could gather endless benefit from it, as long as they managed to comprehend 10 to 20% of it. Their rank wasn't considered too high. Even if they worked hard, it was likely that they would only be able to obtain the position of the Vice City Lord of a 10th grade sacred place in a supreme world. This was a mere pittance to some, but heavenly treasure to them. Warriors who were willing to contemplate at the stone were usually divided into 2 types of warriors. One type were those with extraordinary talent, who believed that they could comprehend the secret of Supreme Lord Sword, and the other type were those with mediocre talent, like Landry and Damien, who didn't want to lead a mediocre life. This was their only chance at greatness. Therefore, to them, these 2 days were the most important 2 days of their lives. More and more cracks appeared, and the words began to slowly peel off and slip down along the stone wall, shattering into pieces as they finally connected with the earth. Every time a fragment fell from the stone, Landry would be the first one to rush up and grab it. He collected those stone fragments, treating them as precious treasures. As he continued doing that, the stone fragments he collected formed a small mountain of their own. He had examined these fragments, which were just ordinary stones and nothing special. Since he had been staring at the stone for tens of thousands of years, now he treated these fragments as treasures. They were as relatives to him, and had become his family after he had spent so many thousands of years observing them. As the last piece of stone fragment fell down, all the words on the giant stone wall peeled off, leaving only a few lines of uneven writing at the edges. Both Landry and Damien stared in awe at the barren rock face now. They waited expectantly for a moment, and then they both stepped back from the rock face. There was no reaction, nor was there any mystery. A bitter smile appeared on Damien's pale face, and heaving a deep sigh, he said, "From now on, we can be free." Free, ha ha, 60,000 years. 60,000 years. I've been sitting here for 60,000 years. Landry's laughter was somewhat hysterical as it echoed back off the blank rock. He had stayed there for 3 times longer than Damien. Back then, when the Willow Island was turned into a place for the passing the torch, all the warriors who were in front of the huge stone had to leave there. Landry had tried his best to strive for the chance to stay there, and he finally made it. Chapter 1070, Long Hair. Even after spending so much time and energy, the 2 warriors got nothing. It was such a big blow. Their expressions were deranged, and they were unable to control themselves. Suddenly, a shallow layer of white mist appeared on the huge rock, floating in the air. At first, the layer of white mist was very light, almost invisible to the naked eye. The 2 of them were sitting on the ground, venting their feelings, and they didn't notice it. The white mist became thicker and was more conspicuous. Landry was lying on the ground, looking at the sky as his miserable laughter resounded in the air. Damien, however, was staring at the rock. His crazy smile froze on his face, and a stunned expression filled his eyes. Landry sensed that something was amiss when he looked at Damien, so he asked, "What's wrong?" Damien surveyed the rock and pointed at the white mist. What the heck is that?" Upon hearing these words, Landry quivered and suddenly turned around. He stared intently at the rock, and suddenly a bright light emitted from his eyes. He was ecstatic now. This is the sword cloud left behind by Supreme Lord Sword. This is. Now Landry was so excited that he couldn't even speak clearly anymore. Damien was just as thrilled. He was gaping at the sight before him. Wisps of the white mist in front of his eyes were slowly floating out from the huge rock. The mist contained water, as the huge rock was damp. The mist was condensing very slowly, and it took a while for a thin layer to appear. Landry had deduced that it was a sword cloud, but he could not see its shape right now. He could only wait for the mist to condense. Zen, on the other hand, naturally wasn't aware of what was happening at the huge rock. Except for him and Layla, all the candidates had completed their tests. As the old man in cotton clothes had made the arrangements, Zen and Layla did not have much of a say in it. He called out the last two names, and the two young warriors stepped into the ancient palace. A moment later, Zen stepped into the illusion space. The illusion space seemed to be engulfed in a thick fog, as if it was a paradise on earth. The ambiance had an ethereal feel to it. In the fog stood many circular stone platforms. There were a total of 200 stone platforms to accommodate the 200 warriors who underwent the trial at the same time. Zen was standing on one of the stone platforms. His gaze swept around and then he saw a stone platform not far from him. Despite the thick layer of fog, he was able to see a blurry silhouette on the stone platform. The mist continued to swirl around them and gradually dissipated, revealing the figure on the stone platform slowly. As there were only two warriors in the illusion space, the silhouette had to be none other than Layla. When the fog dissipated completely, Zen found that Layla was smiling at him and a cyan sword was already in her hand. The sword exuded a simple and austere aura. It was obvious that it was not an ordinary object. Layla liked to collect different hair ornaments, so she often had all kinds of beautiful jewels on her head. However, she had removed all her hair ornaments now, and her straight, black hair, which was almost 10 feet long, floated in the wind. She slowly raised the cyan sword in her hand and yelled, "This time, I will be more focused." It wasn't that she wasn't focused in the enchanted barrier tower, but she hadn't used all of her power. She thought that 28,000 miles was enough and that no one else could overtake her. However, she was proven wrong and she had failed spectacularly. Not only did Zen easily beat her record, he had even gone on to set an unbreakable record. This time, she wouldn't give him the chance. The old man had purposely arranged for Zen and Layla to be in the same round. Perhaps it was because he saw that Layla did not go all out in the previous battle, or maybe he took Sunset World Lord's suggestion. There were only the two of them in the illusion space. Furthermore, they were in very close proximity to each other. She could keep an eye on Zen's progress at all times. This time, she was determined not to underestimate him or give him any leeway. "You two may begin." The old man's voice came from outside the illusion space. "You will be able to start the trial after stepping on the disc below your feet." Outside the illusion space, the Sunset World Lord, the palace leaders, the vice palace leaders, and the warriors who had finished their trials were staring at the two people on the picture slab. Zen looked down at the platform. There were many discs in the middle of the platform. Each of the discs had a number written on it. Right now, the disc before Zen's feet had the word 1 written on it. Evidently, stepping on this disc would signal the start of the first round of the trial. Without hesitation, Zen took a step forward and stepped onto the disc. When Layla saw this, the corners of her mouth lifted. She turned her head, and her shockingly long black hair flowed behind her like a satin ribbon painted by an artist. She, too, gently tapped the first disc with her foot. The first round of trial in the illusion space had commenced. A circle of soldiers, wearing heavy armors and robust helmets, appeared on the stone platform. Zen was indifferent to the presence of this small army. He took out the Thunderwind Divine Sword and did not use its special capability. Instead, when the soldiers approached him, he swung his sword horizontally, slashing his enemies one after another. As the light from the sword flashed, the soldiers were instantly sliced to pieces. After Zen killed the group of soldiers, another group appeared around him. The moment his figure moved, the soldiers turned into fragments once again. After 3 consecutive waves of attacks, the first round of the trial was over. It played out rather quickly. From start to end, it only took about 30 seconds. But when Zen passed the first round and looked to the right, he saw Layla's long hair laid on the platform. She tilted her head and looked at him. It seemed that she had passed the first round before him. Zen smiled slightly and stepped onto the disc with the word 2 as he initiated the second round. The first few rounds of the trial were relatively simple. Even the weakest warriors of the 13 palaces were able to pass the 6th round, and only a few warriors were eliminated in the 7th round. Now Zen did not hesitate. In the second round, his speed increased a little. The long sword in his hand swiftly destroyed the white-robed warriors who were advancing on him. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Compared to the first round of soldiers, these warriors were slightly stronger. But Zen was able to take care of them without much trouble. 30 seconds later, Zen passed the second round. However, Zen found that Layla was still standing where she was, with her long hair spread out on the platform. She was staring at him with a proud smile. Zen was astonished. He had thought that passing the second round in 30 seconds was fast enough. He hadn't expected that Layla to be faster than him in this round too. She mocked him, "You're really slow." Zen shrugged and turned around to step on the third disc. This time, a group of bronze-armored warriors appeared on the platform. But Zen wasn't in a hurry to fight the bronze-armored warriors. Instead, he locked his gaze onto Layla. He wanted to see how she was able to achieve that mind-blowing speed. Layla had activated the third round. The moment the bronze-armored warriors appeared, she gently raised her sword. When she noticed Zen's gaze, she smiled sweetly, and her cyan sword vibrated. All the warriors shook violently, and almost instantly their armors exploded. All the warriors vanished. "Wow, that is truly amazing," Zen exclaimed. He was stunned and was not sure how she did it. No wonder she was able to pass the trial so quickly. Meanwhile, the warriors on his platform had already surrounded him. He was jolted back to the situation on hand and began to deal with them. Chapter 1071, A Sheep. For both Zen and Layla, the first few rounds of the trial were hardly challenging. But the observing crowd outside measured the strength of the two by how fast they passed the trial. Zen is still a bit weaker than Layla, he's naturally faster than the other warriors, but he's still inferior to her. Is there any point in comparing their speed, though? I believe that Zen can do it too, but it's not really necessary. It's not like whoever's the fastest can always win. It's still a significant factor to consider. Speed and strength should be proportional. Some warriors will slow down after passing the 5th round, making it even more difficult to pass through the 6th round. They'll barely make it through the 7th round and probably fail at the 8th round. The palace leaders had no comments to make at present. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. As the formidable sword beam swept across the area, Zen swiftly cut the bronze-armored soldiers to pieces. By then, Layla had already passed the 3rd round of the trial. She could have easily stepped on the 4th disc, but she decided to wait for Zen to pass the 3rd round as well before stepping onto the 4th disc. It was a form of provocation. Every time she opened a new round of trial at the same time with Zen, she could finish it faster than he could. Then, the 4th round was activated. Suddenly, many strange-looking white beasts appeared on the platform. Perhaps Zen had felt Layla's provocation and purposely sped up his movements. As soon as the 4th round began, Zen infused a sliver of chaotic energy into the Thunder Wind Divine Sword, triggering the sword in his hand to thrust forward rapidly. In the blink of an eye, he had thrust out over 10 stabs. Crack! At this moment, about a dozen sword lights that brought along with wind and thunder aggressively shot out. In an instant, all the white beasts on the stone platform were defeated by Zen. He passed the 4th round. The white beasts appeared stronger than the warriors from before. When Layla raised her sword to make use of the same method, the white beasts only spat out blood. After the second vibration of the sword, they fell to the ground. In the 4th round, Zen worked faster than Layla. After she finished off the white beasts, she intended to start the 5th round after Zen had finished the 4th. But this time, he was calm and composed, standing in the middle of the platform. The corners of his lips tugged up as he stared at her. Humph! Layla snorted, pursing her lips in annoyance as she immediately began the 5th round. Since the two were competing in terms of speed, the tempo of the round sped up increasingly. In the usual practice, the further they went, the slower they would get. The increasing difficulty of each round of the trial would slow them down. Previously, some strong warriors had also pursued speed in the earlier rounds, but they would eventually slow down. However, not only did Zen and Layla refuse to slow down, but they both also increased their speed dramatically. In the 5th round of the trial, Layla spent 12 seconds, whereas Zen spent 13. In the 6th round, Zen spent 9 seconds, while Layla spent 10. As for the 7th round, both of them spent 9 seconds. Their speed was still about the same. In the 8th round, they spent 6 seconds. Then, the 9th round. The palace leaders were still calm. Zen's and Layla's speed increased as the strength inside them exploded, growing stronger. The rest of the warriors were all left flabbergasted. Layla's and Zen's results were already enough to make them stand out. Still, a number of warriors were still not convinced enough. The first factor among warriors to measure strength was always their difference in combat strength. Perhaps the two had managed to grasp some method to walk further in the law storm, but that didn't mean they were stronger in combat when faced with the others. But no one could use any tricks to pass the trial in the illusion space, only those with truly formidable strength could stand out. As for Layla and Zen, both were at the life and death realm, one in the 5th grade and the other in the 9th grade. It was unlikely that either could manage to go any further. But after these 9 rounds, the battle strength displayed by the two would be too difficult for the warriors to accept. The first 6 rounds wouldn't be too much for the warriors to handle, but after that, they would all need to get serious. In spite of that, Zen and Layla acted like their opponents were mere infants. They didn't seem to take their enemies seriously at all. They were moving at lightning speed. Both of them had barely spent 6 seconds passing the 10th round. "They're monsters. I'm no match for Layla," one of the warriors said as he shook his head. "Haha, are you kidding? You want to fight her? I heard that the moment she entered the Mist Palace, she already defeated all the other talents. Even she is at the life and death realm, her real strength can't be overlooked. Zen is even more terrifying. He is only at the 5th grade of the life and death realm, but he's so strong." The first 10 rounds took them a total of only about 5 minutes. For the previous batches of warriors, if they wanted to pass through the first 10 rounds, they needed at least 30 minutes. But in the 11th round, even those two slowed down. Originally, Zen planned to increase his speed during the 11th round. Since Layla had the guts to compete with him in speed, he decided that he wouldn't lose to her. But the opponents in the 11th round were completely different. In the first 10 rounds, all the opponents were created by the magic array, they weren't considered real-life forms. But the warriors in the 11th round all wore different expressions. Some had cold smiles plastered on their faces while others wore calm gazes. It was startling, even for Zen. Although he had observed the trial through the picture slab earlier, he hadn't taken close enough look at them. "Are you also the warriors who have entered the illusion space?" he asked. "Yes," one of them answered with a smile. "We are at the other side of Willow Island. This is a different kind of trial for us. Not every warrior had the chance to enter the 13 palaces, after all. In fact, there were many warriors in the alliance that wanted to make it. But only the most elite warriors could enter the 30 palaces. Some warriors couldn't grab their chance to do so, so they had to grapple at every other means they could find to get close. While they were unable to participate in passing the torch, they were qualified to serve as sparring partners, waiting on the other side of Willow Island. When the warriors participating in passing the torch opened up the illusion space and passed the first 10 rounds of the trial, the sparring partners would be able to enter the illusion space and serve as opponents of the warriors from the 13 palaces. The warriors in the 13 palaces who performed well could go through about 15 to 16 rounds of trial. In each round after the 10th, over 10 sparring partners would be assigned to enter the illusion space and fight against a warrior. Each time, 200 warriors would accept the trial in the illusion space. So on the other side of Willow Island, there were over 30,000 sparring partners on standby. Every time a warrior entered the 11th round, the sparring partners would enter the illusion space and surround the warrior within to attack. With this arrangement, not all sparring partners had the chance to enter the illusion space. Even as sparring partners, they still had to fight for the position. Every sparring partner had to work especially hard. And because in the illusion space, ultimately, no one died, the sparring partners could try all means to defeat their opponents without limit. These sparring partners were talents of many sacred places, it was only that their talent wasn't quite enough for them to enter the 13 palaces. Their hearts yearned for it and they couldn't help but be filled with envy toward the warriors of the 13 palaces. Since they had the opportunity to fight with a warrior from the 13 palaces, even if they weren't a good match and were likely to be killed, they would still try to inflict as many blows on him as possible. In this way, they were exceptionally vicious. Zen nodded slightly as he heard it. The arrangement might be rather troublesome, but it wasn't anything Zen couldn't handle. "Guys, he's only at the 5th grade of life and death realm, this is an opportunity. We must finish him in the 11th round to get a good reward out of this." The dozen or so sparring partners turned into something like a pack of hungry wolves as they discovered a sheep strolling on the prairie. With that, they surged forward and began attacking Zen mercilessly. Chapter 1072, Torture. On the other side of Willow Island, tens of thousands of warriors were gathering together in a large square. The journey into the Orange Sea world was a great opportunity for these warriors to spar with the talents of the 13 palaces. Not only that, if they got to injure or kill any talent, they'd receive quite a number of rewards. And it was these rewards that made them salivate with greed. However, this round of passing the torch was coming to an end. They could only wait until the next passing the torch if they wanted to participate. There are 161 opponents in the last round. Shouldn't the test be over? Yes, it's not 200, so those warriors should be the last group. However, they have now especially arranged 2 warriors to fight. If my guess is correct, then this fight is going to be a good one. These 2 people should be extremely special or outstanding. A test with only the 2 of these warriors could only mean that they are going to be exceptional. Outstanding. Exceptional. It's just 2 life and death realm martial artists. I bet that kid at the 5th level won't even pass our first round of sparring. This first round of sparring referred to Zen's 11th round of test. Because these martial artists had only started to get involved in the illusion space from the 11th round, those who got eliminated in the first 10 rounds had no chance of ever meeting with these warriors. The warriors all talked amongst themselves as they observed both Zen and Layla through the picture slab. No matter what, we'll just have to wait and see how our buddies will perform for this round. The warriors had all been strictly subdivided according to their strength, with the more powerful ones going into the arena in the later rounds. Back in the illusion space, both Zen and Layla were quickly swarmed by their opponents. It was impossible for them to easily defeat these warriors by simply slashing at them with their swords. Their opponents were all living, thinking beings who used various strategies to fight them. Some ran away, others faked their movements, while a few had decided to launch fierce, all-out attacks. However, their cultivation method was still very limited. Their only strength came from their sheer number, but they were all basically only at the 7th or 8th level of the life and death realm. They were a mere 2 or 3 levels higher than Zen and posed no threat to him whatsoever. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Several lights burst forth from the Thunderwind Divine Sword. Ah! The lights shot out and instantly killed 4 people. The other 13 were fortunate enough to have used their movement techniques and managed to avoid the sharp lights. The warriors were mere projections in this illusion space and couldn't really die. However, they felt all the pain that their opponents inflicted upon them. Kill him! Moon-splitting slash! Cyan nether swordsmanship! They all shouted simultaneously, pointing all sorts of weapons at Zen. However, he was already gone before they could even land a strike. Zen had zoomed past them swiftly and reappeared behind them. He raised his sword above his head. Nether God Shadow! Whoosh, 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 whoosh. With a wave of his sword, 13 Nether God Shadows shot out from his sword. This was the first time he had ever used this technique in combat. To his relief, the shadows did not disappoint. Each one had its own method to attack as they charged towards his opponents. In an instant, the 13 remaining warriors had been ripped to shreds by the Nether God Shadows, and then were kicked out of the illusion space. Although this could be considered impressive, the 4,000 warriors from the 13 palaces who were watching them did not feel that this was a big deal. All of them had already gone through the 11 rounds of tests and had already proven themselves in handling these opponents. Still, they couldn't help but nod appreciatively at these Nether God Shadows that Zen had managed to summon to deal with his opponents. The warriors on the other side of Willow Island were a bit more dumbstruck at what they had witnessed. Like they had speculated, they knew Zen and Layla were somewhat special since they were the ones that participated in the illusion space test as a separate group. However, they never imagined that they would be surprised by a mere 5th level life and death realm warrior. The warriors that young man had killed with a single strike were all 2 or 3 levels higher than him. How did he do that? None of them knew. In fact, all of them were currently rendered speechless by what they had just witnessed. I finally know the strength of the Heavenly Alliance's top talents. The 13 palaces are the places to gather young talents to send to the Alliance. These young ones all need to grow before they become true super talents. I can't imagine how terrifying those freaks in the Spring Fragrance Pavilion and the Gauze Pavilion are. HMPH. We'll definitely be able to defeat that kid. Someone harumphed. These warriors were all only slightly inferior to the talents of the 13 palaces, but they were still core members within their sacred places. They all had pride and strength. There was no way they could be killed by Zen that easily. He might have passed the 11th round, but there was still the 12th round waiting for him. They were going to send in their most powerful warriors to fight him. They were also focused on Zen's combat strength, but the Sunset World Lord was more concerned about the Nether God Shadows Zen had summoned. How did he do that? A palace leader asked in bewilderment. Chiron's Thunderwind Divine Sword was quite famous in the past. Shouldn't there only be 3 Nether God Shadows? The Sunset World Lord muttered strangely. This fellow managed to produce 13 Nether God Shadows in one go. Is it because of the powerful sword or the capable young man? Another palace leader asked. Yolanda chuckled at their remarks. Of course it's because of Zen. Chiron was the one who taught him the Nether God Mind method. He himself was only able to make 3 Nether God shadows come out back then. Who would have thought Zen would be able to create 13? Yolanda's words rendered the palace leaders speechless. As for Layla, she had also rendered her opponents speechless once they realized that the person they were supposed to fight was a woman, and more than that, a beautiful woman. However, they mostly respected her as an opponent, though a few still threw out some obscene words. They couldn't resist the pleasure of teasing such a beautiful and talented woman from the 13 palaces. There was really nothing to lose once they entered the illusion space since they couldn't really die in there. They forgot that despite not really dying, Layla could still make them suffer intense pain while inside the space. She raised her cyan longsword that began to vibrate at a high frequency. A ripple had been created by this sword and began to spread around the vicinity. These ripples were invisible to the naked eye. Layla had used this method in the first 10 rounds but, this time, the longsword vibrated even faster. It was a similar technique but with a slight twist. During this moment, the warriors all began to charge towards her. Some were not even charging to fight but to do something dirty to Layla. However, not one of them could even lay a single strike on her. The fastest of them, after getting at least 20 feet away from Layla, suddenly began to feel his heartbeat strangely. In fact, all of them found it hard to breathe and control their bodies. And then, an intense pain suddenly burst from their cinnabar field. A warrior would typically pass out once the pain became too much for his physical body to bear. However, they all remained conscious despite being tortured by the vibrations of Layla's sword. It was as if they were prisoners who were constantly being tortured and woken up with cold water. The pain was too much and they all wished they could die as fast as possible to escape the suffering in this illusion space. That was when they realized that they might have underestimated their opponent. Layla might have looked unsophisticated but she was very capable of making sure her enemies suffered for doing her wrong. Right now, she shifted her focus from competing with Zen to accurately controlling the pain her opponents were feeling instead. It lasted for a few seconds, a minute, a few minutes. But it felt like hundreds of years for these warriors. At that moment, voice of the old man in cotton clothes rang out, "Layla, stop." He murmured magnanimously. These martial artists had been invited by the 13 palaces, after all. It wouldn't be too good if she went on to torture them like this. Humph, she scoffed. Layla drew a circle with the tip of her sword, her 10 feet long black hair casting down from her chest, waist, and going all the way to her legs. The end of her hair spread spirally as she stabbed the sword into the platform and used her finger to lightly flick on its steel surface, producing a clear, metallic sound. Pop! The suffering warriors instantly exploded into a bloody mist. Chapter 1073, Strategies. Zen had already completed the 11th round of the challenge. He stood on his platform, observing Layla's battle. He could not force back a shake of his head as he watched. Layla was using some sort of profound sword cry technique. The place rang with the blood-curdling cries of her opponents. It was brutal torture, the violence extending to the spectators. Soon enough, the old man in the cotton clothes came forward to put a stop to it. The blood mist exploded and the martial artists were kicked out of the illusion space. The match was over, however, the image of pain was something that would haunt them forever. The memory was paralyzing, as if they were reliving the same ordeal. Their faces had turned deathly pale, a few of them not managing to keep hold of their consciousness and fainting. The martial artists on the other side of the Willow Island bore witness to this with growing rage. The violence was needless. Layla was a top talent of the 13 palaces. That had been established, but there was no need to go to the lengths of torture in which she subjected her opponents, since everyone here was a training partner. How could she use them as a display of power? That little jerk. I will defeat her in the second round to teach her a lesson. But we can only send out the martial artists from the second group for the second round. With her strength, I'm not certain they will be able to stop her. Even if they can't stop her, they will have to put her in her place. The plaza was abuzz with sounds of disorderly voices and mutters. The tens of thousands of people in the plaza were divided into dozens of groups and ranked according to their strength and cultivation levels. The second group of martial artists would be facing the 12th round of trial in the illusion space. In terms of strength, they had a slightly higher rank than the first group. At this time, a youth garbed in white walked out from the crowd. "Everyone, quiet down," he spoke in a loud voice. A hush fell over the plaza at his words. This young man in white was not that strong. His cultivation was at the 7th level of the life and death realm, and he was assigned to the first group. Zen and Layla were the last two at the other side, and there were quite many martial artists in the first group. He was inferior to the others, so there was no chance for him to fight. They surely sent their best warriors to fight Zen and Layla, so the trials the two underwent were more difficult than those of the previous martial artists. The young man in white was named Adrian Rao. He was weaker than the others, but he had a nimble mind, brimming with resourcefulness. Previously, when they had been grouped up, he had given a lot of sound opinions and devised strategies with other martial artists that led to their victory over the others from the 13 palaces. "Adrian, what are you saying?" a martial artist inquired. Adrian turned to him, his eyes glinting with certainty. "It will be impossible to defeat these two martial artists in the 12th round, but I have an idea. I hope that you all can cooperate. It might give us a good chance." "Humph, their strength is something else. Whether we follow your advice or not, we will have to throw our lives away just the same," a martial artist said with disdain, his voice edging on defeat. Hearing this, Adrian just smiled faintly and shook his head. "That can't be right," he answered. "They are the most outstanding martial artists in the 13 palaces, so they will definitely not stop at the 12th, or even the 13th or the 14th round. In other words, it is impossible to stop them. Their skills are far beyond ours. Not to mention that the cultivation methods they practice and the cards they have in their hands are not something that we can match. We have all seen it with our own eyes. They were able to defeat martial artists several levels higher than them. It wouldn't be a far stretch to say they could even easily kill us in the next few rounds." "So what?" a martial artist asked disinterestedly. The faint smile on Adrian's face did not falter. "I can force out their trump cards," he said. "This way, the rest of you can counterattack with your own martial skills." Everyone went silent for a moment at his proposition, until a voice broke out of the group. "Forcing these two people to reveal their trump cards? We can't even tell what kind of cultivation method that girl used, so how can we force her to use her trump card?" Adrian turned to the direction of the voice and answered, "She only used the sword cry technique. Perhaps the inheritance she received is better, and with her special skill, she managed to make use of the sword cry technique to the extreme." His voice was confident as he continued, "I know how to break the sword cry technique." Some martial artists who possessed great talent found it difficult to improve their cultivation and strength. However, their skills lay in a different area altogether. They were known as think tank type martial artists, and had a deep understanding of the laws, cultivation methods, legends, treasures, and even the patterns. They could read them like the palms of their own hands. Adrian was one of them. It did not take much to convince everyone. After all, they had already been pushed to a wall. Some of them were still unconvinced, but Adrian's plan was their best chance. All of them were of the younger generation. Not one among them was willing to compromise on their own talent and humiliate themselves. Adrian sensed the crowd's approval as no one else followed with questions. He began laying out the details of the plan. "To my knowledge, the use of the sword cry technique relies on the frequency of vibrations to produce special sound waves. There were some powerful martial artists in the plaza. Quite a number of them were at the Soul Sea realm, with some at the advanced stage. They were among the 10th group, or even the 11th and 12th groups, and they managed to defeat formidable opponents from the 13 palaces in the 20th round. They remained silent as they listened to Adrian. The information he had just provided them was very useful indeed. If they coordinated with one another well, they had a good chance of forcing Zen and Layla to reveal their trump cards. Should this be successful, it would be much easier for them to launch attacks in the 19th and 20th rounds. Before he brought up his opinion, Adrian had already observed Zen and Layla, silently scrutinizing their abilities, characteristics, and preferences. That martial artist called Zen Luo makes use of the edge of the long sword in his hand. He has only revealed his weapon, and his strength is still unknown, Adrian said. Those of you from the second group who are confident in your own cultivation methods, you may fight him yourselves. Adrian did not exactly know the figures released from Zen's sword. However, the sharpness of the nether god's shadow did not escape his sharp, perceptive eyes. Without further information, the best approach would be using cultivation methods to create obstacles for Zen. This would test his strength and his skills. After devising his strategy for dealing with Zen and Layla and discussing it with the others, he seated himself in a corner with a short wooden stick poking out from one corner of his mouth. He fixed his eyes at the image on the picture slab, squinting for better focus. He saw that Zen and Layla had stepped on a disc again. On the surface of the disc was a word written in clear text, 12. It was the 12th round. Zen did not know how many rounds of trials existed in the illusion space. However, at the current stage, he was determined to use his nether god shadow and finish everything all the way. The Nether God Shadow was efficient when dealing with many people. Zen controlled every shadow, each possessing different techniques. Manipulating them required the use of a lot of soul power. However, Zen's soul had already stepped into the Jasper fighting soul realm, so it was not a big consideration. But after the 12th round had begun, Zen had discovered something strange. During the 11th round, the martial artists he encountered were all different. However, this round was much different. All of the martial artists in the 12th round seemed to be proficient in movement techniques. The moment Zen released his Nether God Shadows, his opponents used different kinds of law power to dodge his attacks. Some used the space law to create illusions, some used the earth law to take cover under the earth and make themselves invisible, and some made use of the wind law to fly. What was unusual about all of this was that despite using different approaches, none of them was fighting him directly. Was this an obstacle that the old man had intentionally set up? Or had someone devised a plot against him? Zen speculated the possibilities for a moment, his face wearing a pensive expression, but soon enough, a faint smile appeared on his face. It did not matter what their goal was, he only needed to follow his own plan. The other martial artists' movement techniques were powerful, so he could no longer stay where he was. As he began to move, he was pulled back by something from underneath. Looking down, he discovered that a brown vine had appeared beneath his feet and firmly tied him to the ground. It will take more than a flimsy vine to tie me up, Zen thought to himself. Ignoring the coiled strand on his leg, he took a step forward. At first, he thought of forcing the vine to tear apart with the impact of his movement. However, he did not imagine that the vine was extremely tenacious. Not only did it remain intact, it even grew longer as it moved along with his body. Whoosh! With a backhand slash, the vine snapped in half. Immediately, two more vines sprang from the ground and once again restrained Zen, gripping him in their tight hold. It was at this same time that the martial artists who had been dodging his attacks began to charge towards him from all directions. This scene had left the martial artists of the 13 palaces bewildered and slightly impressed. It was beyond their expectations that these fellows would work together so well. Even the Lord of the Sunset World and the others had surprised expressions on their faces. One of the palace masters said faintly, "Someone from the Willow Island must have offered advice. I hate to admit it, but it is a clever plan." Chapter 1074, The Space Characteristic. The warrior's attacks were futile under the suppression of absolute strength. At most, it could only create some obstacles for the opponent. This was the view shared by most of the warriors. Since Zen had easily broken through the 11th round of the test, the 12th round shouldn't cause too much trouble for him. There wasn't any trace of panic on his face, even if he was being attacked by more than a dozen warriors and his movements were restricted by vines. As the warriors surrounded him, a crackling sound suddenly came from the Thunderwind Divine Sword. The difference between these warriors and those from 13 palaces was not just in terms of talent or strength. Those warriors from 13 palaces were also advanced when it came to the weapons they wielded. Those warriors wouldn't have any difficulty at all obtaining a 3rd rank or secondary 2nd rank divine weapon in the weapon house. Zen's Thunderwind Divine Sword was one of the amazing 1st rank divine weapons. The sword would be much more powerful once combined with the law power that was erupting from the chaotic energy. It was something that these warriors could not withstand. Moreover, there was also the unstoppable Nether God Shadow. The power of thunder suddenly spread out around Zen. The bright blue lightning was only as thick as his pinky, but it formed a circular thunder net with Zen as the center. This was equivalent to using a layer of thunder net to sift through the entire platform. There was no room for escape at all. The warriors attacking him immediately burned as if struck by lightning. Their bodies turned pitch black, and after hovering in the air for about 3 seconds, they fell onto the platform. After that, Zen smelled the scorched flavor. Whoosh, whoosh. Another figure appeared in the air right after the thunder net eased out. This warrior's main cultivation method was making use of the space law, and it was only him who survived the attack. However, just as this warrior had avoided the attack and was plotting to assassinate Zen, 7 figures had appeared before him. These were the 7 Nether God Shadows cast by Zen. In the blink of an eye, they had torn that warrior into pieces. Zen then passed the 12th round. Compared to the 11th round, the 12th round was a bit strenuous for Zen. It was relatively more challenging than those he had already passed. What he didn't know though was that there were tens of thousands of warriors with depressed faces, standing just on the other side of the Willow Island. They had made a plan to force Zen to use the ace in the hole. However, Zen only relied on the Thunderwind Divine Sword even after 12 rounds. Could it be that he relied solely on this sword? The warrior named Adrian was still indifferent while sucking the wooden stick. Zen's state of mind was much more stable than he had imagined. He couldn't guess which aspect Zen was good at. Thus, he had arranged the advanced and fierce warriors to take Zen down. Nonetheless, he still failed to provoke Zen. How could such a talent only rely on his weapon? He couldn't believe how Zen completely ignored what he did. After spending a while fighting those warriors, Zen still passed the 12th round without using anything else but his sword. Zen should be more troublesome, Adrian thought disdainfully. He then gazed at the highest point of the enormous square. The tens of thousands of warriors in the whole square were arranged in a fan-shaped formation with the low-level warriors standing at the front. The number of high-level warriors at the back was very small. It was only normal for any place to have a lot of low-level warriors and only a few high-level warriors. This place was no exception to that. It was just that most of the talents of 13 palaces tended to stop at around the 11th or 12th round. Only very few warriors had the guts and qualifications to challenge other more powerful warriors. This number would even be lesser in the 18th round, the 19th, or the 20th round. Thus, it wasn't really necessary to arrange more powerful warriors for the passing the torch. The existence of some extraordinary talents had also been taken into account when the illusion space was designed and built. There were several cages standing at the highest point of the square. Inside those cages were burly but ragged warriors. They were the condemned prisoners from the villain world and the ultimate challenge in the illusion space. But until now, no warriors had the chance to challenge the prisoners in the illusion space. The reason why Adrian showed up at this moment was because of these condemned prisoners. The battle that Layla took part in had not been over yet. Just as Zen had thought, Layla planned to use the sword cry technique before the 20th round of the test. If Adrian hadn't appeared and meddled in the fight, Layla's sword cry technique would have been enough to deal with all her battles in the first 19 rounds. It wouldn't have been easy to break her sword cry technique. More so, it would have been impossible for the 11th to 19th round warriors to defeat her. However, Layla soon discovered that her sword cry technique had lost its effect during the 12th round. All of the warriors that Zen encountered in the 12th round were well trained in all sorts of dodging movements. Thus, he couldn't fight them head to head at all. However, the warriors Layla encountered were those who cultivated the water law. After the challenge began, the warriors created a curtain of water over the platform. Some of them even created a monstrous wave washing over the whole place. All liquids were viscous. Although Layla's sword cry technique was extremely powerful, she was unable to perform it underwater. Her sword cry technique's power was greatly reduced and couldn't even cause any warrior real harm. She was caught off guard by their attack and forgot to use her life vitality to protect herself. Thus, her entire body was thoroughly wet. Her clothes stuck to her body. Layla, of course, could guess what was going on. This was definitely a strategy that someone had deliberately set up to deal with her sword cry technique. None of the warriors were talking nor approaching Layla. None of them were hiding from her too. However, each of them performed their own skills. Some of them continued to unleash large waves one after another towards Layla, while the others created water spears to attack her. These attacks were nothing in Layla's eyes. With a light wave of the cyan long sword in her hand, she easily dispelled the incoming attacks. Very soon, the corner of her mouth curled up into a smile. You think that I can only use the sword cry technique." After saying that, she held the cyan sword above her head again. Her body trembled slightly as the cyan sword drew and left many sword shadows in its wake. She didn't want to kill all those warriors one by one. So, she was using some powerful sword skill to kill all the warriors on the platform with a single strike. Hearing this, Adrian on the other side of the Willow Island said calmly, "Of course I don't think so. I just want to see how many trump cards you have." Layla's actions were exactly what he wanted to see. The sword shadows Layla created with her sword started to spin faster and faster. The dense sword shadows covered Layla's entire body. At this time, the power of the space law surged from Layla. With her other hand, she gently waved in the air, causing the space outside of the sword shadows to directly collapse. She actually erased the surrounding space. That is Chiron's space erasing hand. "It seems that he treats Layla well and even taught her such a great skill," remarked the Lord of the Sunset World. His eyes were gleaming with familiarity as he watched the girl's cultivation skill. "This isn't how a space erasing hand works. She's wasting it," Yolanda commented flatly. The space erasing hand was one of Chiron's famous consummate skills. It would require a deep comprehension of the space law for a warrior to use such a skill. When performing this skill, the warriors would need to stretch out their hands to touch the space and erase the place surrounding them, making it disappear. Of course, the space that Chiron could erase was naturally large compared to what Layla could. The girl was only able to erase the space outside of her sword shadows. It was a circular space that was over 100 feet wide. The warriors using the water law cultivation were standing around the edge of the platform at first. However, their bodies had no option but to involuntarily move as soon as the space around them was erased. This was also a special characteristic of space. Normally, a warrior who cultivated the space law might not be able to use the space erasing hand. Nonetheless, they still understood the principles behind it. If a section of space in the middle was missing, the sections of space on both sides would instantly stick together. Those warriors were in the outer space of the platform when Layla had erased a circle of space in the middle. Thus at this moment, all the warriors were pulled to the center by the space as a section of space had been missing. And in the center of the platform, the sword shadows were still rapidly spinning. In a blink of an eye, those warriors, who had been pulled in, were cut into pieces. Chapter 1075, Purpose. Under the furious onslaught of Layla's sword shadows, the warriors standing up against her had almost no room to fight back. They were quickly sliced into pieces and kicked out of the illusion space, never to be seen or heard from again. As her life vitality gently revolved, Layla's body began to emit a white mist, and the moisture from her wet clothes instantly disappeared, as if the mist was a warm and comfortable fire. She put both of her hands behind her head and gently stroked her astonishingly long hair. The white mist now surrounded her hair too and spread to the end of her long, lustrous locks. Even so, Layla's expressions weren't exactly happy. Though busy fighting, she still had been able to notice Zen, who had passed the 12th round of the test long before her. He was standing in front of her with a long sword in his arms, looking at her with a meaningful gaze. She looked towards him and gave him a fierce glare. "Don't be cheeky. I'll be faster than you in the next round." Zen smiled faintly and a noncommittal expression appeared on his face in response. He then silently started the 13th round. Adrian had already arranged 3 groups of candidates to deal with them in the 13th round. Right now, he was going to take care of a more serious matter. While Zen and Layla were fighting, he passed through a crowd of people in the enormous square and headed towards the large cages. These cages were 7 in number and placed on a high platform. If a warrior was able to hold on to himself through the final challenge, these cages would be opened and the condemned prisoners within them would be released. This was the ultimate trial of the passing the torch event. The cages were enormous, but the warriors inside had been standing ever since they had been locked in. One among them was a burly and sturdily built man, who looked like the most powerful of them all. From beginning to end, the burly man had never opened his eyes. All of these prisoners were extremely strong and even from a distance, emitted an extremely ruthless aura. Almost all of the warriors who participated in the training were unwilling to approach this platform. Adrian flew towards the platform and headed straight for the large cage in the middle. Inside it, the burly man was sitting still with his eyes closed. "Who are you?" he asked when he sensed someone approach him. "My name is Adrian Rao," Adrian replied with a smile. "What do you want?" came a gruff and succinct response. Adrian placed his head next to the pillar of the cage and softly uttered, "I want something, it's about the secret treasure of the dark world." Before Adrian could even finish his words, the burly man's eyes popped open and he stood up. The instant he opened his eyes, an extremely sharp soul suppression force was abruptly shot out, making Adrian's body tremble in fear and crumble down. Immediately after that, his face turned extremely pale and he spat out a mouthful of blood. "You are just a nobody. How and what do you know about the secret treasure of the dark world?" the tall man uttered furiously. Although Adrian had just spat out a mouthful of blood, a faint smile still appeared on his pale face. After wiping the traces of blood from the corner of his mouth, he replied, "You are right. I am indeed not a big shot. However, you don't seem to be that important either." Hearing that, the burly man snorted and said, "You are right. I am only a Soul Sea Realm warrior who can easily be called a nobody in this big universe. But you are not qualified to judge me." Adrian smiled faintly. "You were the most outstanding talent of the Star World in the past. I also know you were qualified to enter the Gauss Pavilion. I am obviously not a patch on you. However, in the end, you managed to end up being caught. Now you are just a prisoner who is going to live only for 800 years. This condemned prisoner was going to be executed 800 years later. For mortals, a time span of 800 years was equivalent to a dozen or so lifetimes, but for a Soul Sea Realm warrior, 800 years were nothing. For these prisoners, they were going to be executed real soon. "What on earth are you trying to do?" the burly man asked coldly. Adrian still did not directly answer the burly man's question. Instead, he continued, "You are all condemned prisoners selected from the villain world. However, if you succeed in assassinating the talents of 13 palaces, you can be pardoned and released." "Nonsense," the burly man snorted in a cold voice. He could not believe this man. Warriors who took part in the competition were rewarded with various kinds of objects if they got good results during the event. And these condemned prisoners were supposed to be rewarded if they successfully attacked and killed the talents of 13 palaces. This time, the reward was their freedom. This arrangement was made because the idea of being free and fleeing death would make these prisoners go all out on their opponents. However, these condemned prisoners rarely had the chance to go to battle. Furthermore, once they did get a chance to fight, their opponents were often extremely strong and talented. Thus, they didn't have many chances to obtain freedom. "I can help you get a chance to fight," Adrian spoke. And then, the burly man coldly asked. "I'll teach you how to defeat your opponent and gain your freedom," Adrian responded. On hearing such a notion, the burly man immediately smiled. His smile was filled with contempt for Adrian. "Who are you? A nobody. I don't need you to teach me." The burly man was far stronger than Adrian in terms of cultivation base, strength, and talent. Even if he were to fight with 100 warriors who were as powerful as Adrian, he could have annihilated them himself in an instant. However, Adrian didn't get angry even though he had just been scorned by the burly man. He calmly smiled and replied, "You might not know this, but there are only 2 warriors left in the passing the torch. They are the most powerful warriors who have ever taken part in the event. My advantage is that I have the right to decide which one of you will fight them." Adrian was speaking to the burly man through his life vitality, and the other prisoners nearby couldn't hear his words. Hearing this, the burly man finally frowned. "So, that is the reason you are so confident of yourself and dare to invite me?" "Yes." Adrian had a broad smile on his face. He also took out a pill and put it into his mouth. Just now, the soul suppression force from the burly man had caused some damage to his soul. He had to take care of it. "What do you want? Why would you do this?" the burly man asked again. Adrian then stretched out 3 fingers. 30%. When you find the secret treasures of the dark world, I want 30%. 30%? Do you even know what the secret treasures of the dark world mean? The burly man's face revealed an evil grin. "Yes, I do. I know, and that is why I only want 30%, Adrian replied. Adrian was good at observing others and figuring out their thoughts, and he also behaved with a sense of propriety. Thus, by his own rules, he only wanted to take 30% of the treasures, instead of asking for more. The burly man closed his eyes and let out a deep sigh. He had been very famous and respected in the past, but now, he was exiled to the villain world and his fate was being controlled by a nobody like Adrian. Adrian guessed what the burly man was thinking, and indifferently told him, "Look. Everyone has his own uses. It is true that the warriors of this universe respect only those who are the most powerful among them all, but this matter is also very important. Don't look down on me. If you cooperate with me, it would be even easier for you to get the secret treasures of the dark world." When he was uttering these words, he looked very confident. Perhaps many warriors thought that Adrian was just good at playing petty tricks, but he wanted to show them that these so-called petty tricks could bring about fatal threats, and could even reverse situations. The burly man opened his eyes once again and looked at Adrian with a complicated expression. He then stood up and said indifferently, "All right, I agree." Only then did Adrian return to the massive square with a satisfied expression on his face. There were numerous warriors in the square who were looking at the scenes occurring in the illusion space. They were all discussing about the fight with excitement. Suddenly, someone greeted Adrian, "Adrian, we failed to deal with that woman. How can we break her move and win against her? The warriors in the 3rd group also can't hold on for much longer against her. She is too powerful. Adrian, think of a way." A faint smile appeared on Adrian's face. He replied with a serious tone, "It's fine. The next group should be." In fact, he had no interest in attacking Layla and Zen right now. However, in order to deal with this group of hot-blooded fellows, he naturally had to pay a price. After a series of detailed analysis, he was rewarded with a resounding cheer from the warriors present there. After that, he selected some of the warriors to form the 4th group and sent them into the illusion space for the next round. The 14th round, the 15th round, the 16th round. Inside the ancient palace, the warriors from the 13 palaces could clearly see that the strength that the 2 contestants were displaying inside the illusion space was far beyond their imagination. If the warriors who had passed 19 rounds before them took part in the fights that were going on right now, they probably wouldn't have lasted even for the first 16 rounds. However, Zen and Layla were not ordinary warriors after all. Although they felt that it was getting increasingly difficult to win by the moment, they were still able to suppress their opponents and had passed every round of test till now with their own strength. However, there was still a slight difference between the two of them. Zen was still only relying on his Thunderwind Divine Sword and had not yet showed signs of using any other weapon. However, Layla had already used a number of her trump cards. Each time she made use of a new supernormal skill, her opponents would be able to come up with a method to restrain it, making that skill useless in the next round. This was going to reduce her number of moves with every round. But an advantage she still had was that the number and quality of martial arts she was proficient in were unimaginable. Chapter 1076. The Final Round. Of course, Layla was capable of dealing with these annoying opponents. However, after being targeted by them so deviously, she became rather irritable. She and Zen entered the 20th round not long after these bloodthirsty fights. 20 rounds was the best result that previous warriors of the 13 palaces had achieved. Before this, no one had been able to pass the 20th round because the opponents at that level were all warriors at the middle stage of the Soul Sea realm who had undergone at least 4 big heavenly tribulations. For the talented martial artists of the 13 palaces, it was not difficult to challenge those above their cultivation levels. However, dealing with several Soul Sea realm martial artists at the same time was quite challenging. So it was in this round that Zen and Layla finally felt the immense pressure they were facing. There was a huge chasm between the Soul Sea realm and the Life and Death realm. What was most troublesome were the domains of the Soul Sea realm warriors. The suppression of each of these domains had caused a lot of trouble for Zen and Layla. Finally, things have become tricky for them. These two should not have stopped at the 20th round, right? A palace leader asked. The Sunset World Lord nodded his head indifferently. That's hard to say. This is after all a one-to-many fight, completely different from the test of the Enchanted Barrier Tower. The opponents they have to face are also vastly distinct. Zen could fight back the attacks of the Soul Sea realm warriors even though he is just at the 5th level of the Life and Death realm. I wonder what he will be capable of once he breaks through to the Soul Sea realm. The leaders were paying more attention to Zen because of his extraordinary performance in the Enchanted Barrier Tower. However, another palace leader had a different question in mind. He looked at Yolanda and said, I seem to have overlooked something. How many petals did Zen's lotus flower have? Hearing this question from the palace leader, everyone looked at Yolanda curiously. Before the warriors participated in passing the torch, a selection process had been held for all the martial artists from the palaces. The red cloud ring could sense the strength of the warriors and roughly deduce the number of lotus petals that they had activated. But Yolanda shook her head and said, I don't know. You don't know? Could it be that Zen failed the test? A palace leader asked. No, Yolanda continued, when Zen passed through the red cloud ring, its sensing power closed because it reached its saturation point. It was impossible to deduce how many petals Zen had activated. Hearing Yolanda's words, many leaders were shocked. The Sunset World Lord stared, his eyes flashing. Does that mean it's likely that Zen activated the Mahayana Lotus Flower? In the universe, the Hinayana Lotus Flower and the Mahayana Lotus Flower were both important milestones. Martial artists who could open the 9-petal lotus flower were considered to be top talents, but the number of them who could activate the Mahayana Lotus Flower was few and far between. It was hard to find someone who could achieve this, even among a trillion living beings. How interesting, one of the world lords said, seemingly lost in thought. How about later after we give him the pill, we let him take the 10th tribulation introducing pill? After he triggers the heavenly tribulation, wouldn't we know how many petals he activated in his lotus flower? That doesn't sound very right. Yolanda looked hesitant. What's wrong with it? Isn't it normal practice for warriors to trigger heavenly tribulation and go through it once they finish the test of passing the torch? Another palace leader asked. Many martial artists could not wait to take the 10th tribulation introducing pill, hoping to enhance their cultivation as soon as possible. This was because after undergoing the intense test of passing the torch, they often received great insights on martial arts. Thus, every time passing the torch ended, over 100 warriors chose to undergo the heavenly tribulation. After hearing this suggestion, Yolanda finally nodded. Okay, but I'll let Zen decide for himself. At the moment, the thousands of warriors outside the ancient palace were staring at the battle within the picture slab, exclaiming with disbelief. Although everyone knew that there were no real deaths in the illusion space, the battles within were no different from those in the outside world. When they saw a dangerous situation, they would gasp in shock. The difficulty in the 20th round had increased. Zen started to find it troublesome to deal with his opponents. Although the number of his opponents had reduced to 6, all of these warriors of Soul Sea Realm had a tactic of dividing forces. They formed a two-pronged attack. It was difficult to break through this temporary well-planned formation. The 6 warriors were all at the Soul Sea Realm. Before them, Zen could only be considered a junior. The fact that Zen had not been defeated under the pincer attack of these 6 was already a great humiliation to them. It would be a shame if news spread out that 6 Soul Sea Realm martial artists had joined forces to attack a martial artist who was merely at the life and death realm. However, as Zen and the 6 men fought continuously, they had no time to consider their reputation. They discovered that as time passed, Zen seemed to become more powerful and more in control. Feeling somewhat defeated by Zen, who was only a kid at the life and death realm, they were embarrassed. Moreover, it made them anxious. However, before they went out to fight, Adrian had told them that the most important thing to keep in mind while fighting Zen was to stay calm. No matter what, as long as they forced Zen to use his full strength, it would be counted as a victory for them. In the end, they did it. They experienced Zen's true power. As warriors of the upper world, these warriors of the Soul Sea Realm had seen a lot. However, to their surprise, when Zen's power surged out, they were frightened. In order to fight his great power, one of the warriors at the Soul Sea Realm opened the 11th Earth Domain. The 11th Earth Domain that he had comprehended from the Earth Law was the most solid of all domains. The Soul Sea Realm warrior who employed this domain stood ahead in front of the other 5 warriors. However, such a strong domain was still easily shattered by Zen. Zen, who was at the life and death realm, charged into the group of warriors of the Soul Sea Realm like a tiger before a flock of sheep. The scene was quite shocking to witness. Most of the talents of the 13 palaces could easily defeat warriors of the Soul Sea Realm in a one-on-one fight. However, there were not many like Zen who could defeat so many Soul Sea Realm warriors at the same time. Other than him, perhaps only Layla could do it. After Zen's battle ended, Layla too finished fighting. It seemed that Layla had used a powerful trump card, for a cyan stone appeared on her forehead. She had activated the Wrath of the Ocean. They both passed the 20th round. The two of them obtained the favored results in the test of illusion space at the same time, but it wasn't the end for them. Soon, the 21st round started. Then the 22nd round. Next was the 23rd round. The 24th round. Having learned from previous experience, no one was willing to guess the limits of their abilities. In the Enchanted Barrier Tower, when everyone had assumed Layla's limits in the beginning itself, she had shocked them by reaching 28,000 miles eventually. Later they predicted that Zen would not be able to reach 30,000 miles, but to their bewilderment, he reached 36,000 miles. By now everyone knew that they must not assume the strength of these two. It would be a slap in the face for them otherwise. Zen and Layla had far exceeded their estimations. But the illusion space was different from the Enchanted Barrier Tower. Every round of the test involved warriors prepared to fight them. Since the test was arranged, there had to be certain limitations. On the other side of the Willow Island were about 15 groups of martial artists, divided according to their levels of strength. Each group corresponded to the 11th to the 25th rounds of the test in the illusion space. The martial artists of the 15th group were prisoners of the 3 cages on the high platform. The 25th round was the final round of the test. From beginning to end, Adrian had been the one to work out the strategies and give suggestions. Even though his plan had not been successful against Zen and Layla, everyone had seen its effect. Therefore, they were happy to have Adrian give them orders. At that moment, he once again stepped onto the high platform on top of the enormous square. If we want to fight that woman, we'll have to send these condemned prisoners into the battlefield. I heard that these condemned prisoners were all extraordinary characters who came from the villain world. If they can defeat those two in the ultimate round, they will be able to get their freedom. I believe they would go all out for it, right? Under the gazes of the crowd, Adrian walked toward the tall and sturdy man and asked, 2 people have entered the final round. A man and a woman, which one do you choose to fight? The burly man asked arrogantly, are you joking? How could I choose a woman? I suggest you choose the woman. The man is very strong and has an unfathomable level of strength. I, at least, haven't seen his limits so far, Adrian said in a low voice. After so many rounds, he had not even accomplished his goal. What vexed him especially was that he could not figure out how far Zen's strength went. How strong is he? The burly man asked. He's at the 5th level of the life and death realm, Adrian replied truthfully. The burly man narrowed his eyes and looked at Adrian coldly. Are you insulting me, saying that he is strong at that level? Even if the man Adrian had mentioned was considered to be a top talent within the 13 palaces, the fact that the man was still only at the 5th level of the life and death realm was the only thing that vexed the burly man. Chapter 1077, Brother. This man's pride was steep and could not allow him to accept the fact that his opponent was a mere 5th level life and death realm warrior. And could his opponent even be called a warrior? In front of him would be no man, but a mere kid. The burly man couldn't help but scoff in disbelief. However, he was also reminded of the fact that this kid was still a talent of the 13 palaces. Was it really wise to look down on him this early in the fight? It also did not escape his attention that this kid had made it past the 24 rounds that were prerequisite to facing him. Only those who managed such a feat could be considered a top existence within the 13 palaces. How in the world was he only at the 5th level of the life and death realm? Don't underestimate him. I've been watching him for the past 24 rounds and I'm certain that this guy hasn't even shown us half of the stuff he can do, Adrian advised him. If I had a guess, I'd say he was only using around 30% of his true strength. 30%? Against several warriors of the Soul Sea realm? The burly man remarked in surprise. That's why my suggestion for you is to choose that woman, Adrian told him. Zen and Layla had both emerged victorious in all 24 rounds. They were like battering rams that rushed unimpeded against all those who stood in their way. Adrian's slight change in tactics gave them a bit of trouble, but the two still managed to emerge victorious. Zen was a low-key fighter who preferred to use his long sword as his primary weapon. Layla, on the other hand, preferred flashy movements and unique martial art techniques, filling the crowd in awe with epic scenes on the battlefield. This dynamic told a lot about these two. Because of Zen's low-key nature, Adrian realized that he was most probably hiding a lot of his strengths and techniques, which made him an unpredictable opponent. Layla, on the other hand, showed all her skills off, but this might also backfire on her since predictability was never an advantage in battle. The palace leaders shared his view, even the Sunset World Lord thought the same. These people were all ranked higher in terms of strength and knowledge, but Adrian's intuition amazed them. Unfortunately, the burly man did not heed Adrian's advice. Nah, I think I'll go with the boy, he snickered. A warrior who possesses such strength while still at the life and death realm is worth my attention. Adrian's face darkened at his words. Truth be told, he wasn't at all interested with these so-called talents. His to-do list was already full: defeating Layla, freeing the burly man, and excavating the secret treasures of the dark world. The entire point of this trial was for them to win, no matter what. Zen was obviously a hard opponent and Adrian wasn't that confident of their victory against him. He was about to talk him out of fighting Zen, but the burly man huffed angrily at him. I'll make sure to win the battle, but I choose my own enemy. Got it? His words immediately silenced Adrian, but the burly man wasn't done. I am someone who almost got into the Gauze Pavilion. I'm not going to chicken out in front of a junior and go fight with a little girl. What will that make me? I'm not willing to become a laughingstock for everyone to point at after this trial. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pick that young boy and I'm going to defeat him so you can just sit back and clap along with everyone else once I win. Adrian couldn't help but sigh. This fellow was too arrogant for his own good. If not for his cockiness back then, he wouldn't have been chained up and imprisoned in the villain world before being sentenced to death. Still, Adrian couldn't really do anything. This burly man was the key figure in his whole plan. The only thing he could do was to sit back, relax, and clap along with everyone else once he won, just like the burly man advised him to. If he won, Adrian couldn't be sure. He looked away and took a good long look at Layla and then towards the other cages beside him. For these men who had been sentenced to death, the chance to earn their freedom by winning this battle was like a golden ray of hope in their dark, dreary lives. However, this golden ray of hope was held by one person, Adrian. Those who sincerely wanted to fight Layla would have to prove themselves to him. The ultimate trial: how many opponents will appear? Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Zen was a picture of calm and determination. This was his last trial in the illusion space. Layla, on the other hand, was also quietly waiting for her final opponent not too far away. The past trials had made her quite unhappy. Despite leaving behind those other warriors from the 13 palaces, the fact that Zen still managed to hold his ground and enter the final round with her irked her. That wasn't all, Zen managed to pass the trials faster and faster. In the last couple of rounds, he passed them twice as fast as she did, which upset her. Layla hadn't been able to keep up with him and raise her own pace, not even by a little bit. But she couldn't be discouraged. Since they entered the final round almost at the same time, there might be a draw between them after the fight. She could only hope for a stronger opponent on his battlefield in the final round. The thought was enough to cheer her up a little. Shortly after, a faint ray of light coalesced on the battlefield and unveiled Layla's opponent. Her designated foe was a man, sporting a prominent scar on his forehead and dressed in tattered rags. A sinister aura emanated from his whole body, and Layla did not miss the way he looked at her, as if he was a starving beast and she was a piece of bloody meat. "A warrior who cultivates on an evil path," she remarked and slightly raised her guard. She knew that this fight wasn't going to be easy, since this kind of opponent would definitely have some unique skills that might catch her off guard. "I'm such a lucky guy to get a little girl as my opponent," the man said through gritted teeth. For this trial alone, 7 prisoners were chosen and sent in from the villain world. However, only 2 of them had the privilege to fight. The burly man had already chosen Zen, so this scarred man decided to go with Layla since he figured the little girl would be easy to deal with. He had already spent quite a bit of fortune gaining the privilege of fighting from Adrian, so he was definitely going all out against his opponent. The man's aura was frightening, but Layla remained unfazed. She reminded herself that this was going to be the last round of her trial, and if her opponent was this strong, then Zen's was most probably going to be at the same level. Her opponent might look strong, but it wasn't going to be impossible for her to defeat him. Just as she summed up her strategy in defeating this scarred man, she couldn't help but look towards Zen's direction. What about him? Who did he get? She thought to herself just as a burly man appeared in front of him. Her eyes immediately widened at the sight. Layla couldn't help but yell out something that caused a huge shock to everyone afterwards. The burly man had stepped into the battlefield and confirmed that his opponent was indeed a kid at the 5th level of the life and death realm. Still, he couldn't really look down on him. Zen had, after all, passed the trials and was able to last until the final round, which meant he wasn't ordinary in the slightest. Besides, measuring an opponent's power just by looking at his cultivation base was not wise. However, the burly man was once a proud genius of the Alliance, so he couldn't help but be cocky. As he mentioned earlier, he was someone who almost reached the Gauze Pavilion before his life was turned upside down and he was sent to the villain world. For his whole life, he chased power and challenged those stronger than him. Yet, this time, it was the other way around. Today, he faced a kid who ranked lower than himself. His cultivation base had remained stagnant in the villain world given its scarce resources, but he did not fear a mere life and death realm warrior. He looked Zen up and down and tried to size him up while Zen did the same to him. To Zen, the burly man's cultivation base was quite firm and powerful, but he also sensed a strong level of pride in him. There was no doubt that his opponent was a hardcore fighter with formidable strength. Zen sighed. This is going to be a tough fight, he thought to himself. However, just as the two looked at each other's eyes, a yell was heard from the battlefield right next to them, "Brother!" Zen was astonished by Layla's scream, as were the audience, who watched with agape mouths as the scene in front of them unfolded. The burly man gazed at Layla in confusion. He knew he had a sister, but he left her 10 years ago after being sent to the villain world. She was only around 7 or 8 years old at the time, which was why he didn't recognize her at first glance. "Brother, it's me, Layla," she shouted, her heart bursting with anxiety on whether he remembered her or not. Her declaration of her name cleared the remaining doubt on the man's face and replaced it with a kind of light that had evaded him for a long time. The little girl whom Adrian had mentioned was actually his sister. And to think that she had grown up to be such a powerful warrior, the feelings rushed over him like a tidal wave as he tried to process this piece of information. He couldn't believe that he almost faced against his very own sister. Even the Sunset World Lord sat in shock, also not expecting this kind of coincidence to occur in this ultimate trial. Chapter 1078, Link and I. The usually placid face of the Sunset World Lord was now marred with confusion. "Who is this person?" he asked. However, Yolanda merely blinked upon hearing his question and stayed silent. At that moment, one of the palace leaders spoke up. "I remember him. This is the little fellow who held a grudge against the son of the Supreme Lord Winfred during the Heavenly Fruit Assembly. That specific incident wasn't long ago, and it had only been a little more than a decade. The mere mention of it made the other palace leaders remember it as well. This man's name should be Link and I, that peerless talent of the major cultivation world. Back then, the Gauze Pavilion wanted to break the rules to include him in their group, but the dispute between him and the Supreme Lord Winfred had him exiled to the villain world," another palace leader chimed in. "Layla, Link and I, are they really siblings?" Meanwhile, the martial artists from the 13 palaces outside the ancient hall seemed to have an even more intense reaction than the palace leaders themselves. Link and I was just a talent from the younger generation in the eyes of the palace leaders. They didn't have a strong memory of him. Their dispute wasn't anything big back then, and it was normal for him to be unknown to the people like the Sunset World Lord. However, Lincoln I was popular among the younger generation. The moment his burly figure appeared, some martial artists had already recognized him. It's Lincoln I. He actually got released from the villain world. Lincoln I is Zen's opponent. If the Supreme Lord Winfred hadn't punished Lincoln I back then, he would have probably reached the Spirit Supreme Realm now. Not just the Spirit Supreme Realm. His cultivation was only at the Life and Death Realm at that time, and he was supposed to be recruited by the Gauze Pavilion. His future could have been limitless. What a pity. For many of the common martial artists, it was easy for Lincoln I to have the support of the lower-level martial artists because he had been oppressed by Supreme Lord Winfred. There were various legends about him everywhere, and even a rumor that he had once entered hell and fought all sorts of evil spirits just to save a friend. The core members of the Alliance might be unfamiliar with all those legends, but the lower class of martial artists thought all of them were superb. I didn't expect Layla to be Lincoln I's sister. Both these two siblings are indeed powerful. Lincoln I was fierce, having sparred with the overly proud son of Supreme Lord Winfred at the Heavenly Fruit Assembly, where he ruthlessly shamed his rival in defeat. His little sister's talent is no joke, either. The heated discussion among the younger cultivators only increased. Everyone had something to say about the fierce, exiled warrior. If Layla could name a happiest memory, it would have to be right now. Never in a million years would she have thought to see her brother in the illusion space. She knew that her brother had offended someone powerful, and thus was exiled into the villain world. On top of that, he had only 800 years to live. However, 800 years was more than enough for her. She would grow stronger within that time frame and save her brother from the villain world. She had committed this secret vow to heart, and never shared it with anyone else ever since she had chosen to take the path of martial arts. Her brother's figure, clad in tattered clothes, came into view. She briefly thought of his tall and powerful persona when she was younger, and felt like shedding tears. Layla, it's really you. The smile on Lincoln I's face only grew wider. His sister was a young woman now, but he could still vaguely make out her childhood appearance. He was more than ecstatic to see his sister in the same place. He had gone through a lot after being exiled. The villain world had no rules, and had extremely limited resources. It definitely wasn't easy to survive there, but because of Adrian this time, he had a chance to get his freedom. And now that he had seen his sister, he saw that she had indeed become powerful already. Tears welled up in Layla's eyes as she nodded. She was so excited that she didn't know what to say. A chuckle burst out of Lincoln I's lips. This is truly great. I didn't expect that we would reunite on the day I would get my freedom. Once I defeat this kid, I'll be free. Upon hearing Lincoln I's words, Layla's expression suddenly changed. They'll set you free if you defeat Zen. She'd never heard of such a reward. Yes, indeed, Lincoln I said with a nod. Light sparkled in Layla's eyes as she turned to face Zen. Zen, will you please admit defeat? She pleaded. Zen was speechless at the sudden turn of events. Why did his opponent have to be Layla's brother? And Layla, who had wanted to challenge him in the Mist Palace, now wanted him to surrender. This was unbelievable. Don't worry, I will admit defeat too, Layla said seriously. I can give up the final test. Then we'd have the same results, she added. Once again, Zen was speechless at Layla's words. All this time, he'd never considered her as an opponent. His participation in the passing the torch was only for his own assessment. Zen also had a younger sister. While Layla and her brother had reunited in this place, there had been no news so far of Zen's sister. Of course, it wasn't that Zen didn't want to help the siblings. I beg of you, Layla implored. She'd been such a proud girl before, but now she urgently hoped that Zen would respond in kind. She continued, I will do my best to fulfill any request you have. Anything is fine, please. Just as Zen was about to agree, Lincoln I suddenly laughed. Layla, how can you beg? But, however, her brother interrupted her before she could finish. I've always relied on myself. How can I let my sister beg for me? Don't you have confidence in me? Do you think I am no match for this fellow in front of you? He said arrogantly. The two siblings didn't come from a privileged family. The I family was just a fourth-grade noble family from the borderlands. They were simply too ordinary compared to the 7th grade, 8th grade, and even 9th grade and 10th grade noble families. But even so, Lincoln I had quickly become famous and had even been appreciated by the Gauze Pavilion. He had always relied only on himself to gain other people's favor, too proud to ask for help. Thus, he absolutely couldn't stand his sister begging someone else for his freedom. Meanwhile, Zen had really intended to just admit defeat. But when Lincoln I said those words, he couldn't say anything. These siblings seemed to have the same temper and were too proud. Zen could only shake his head, and felt somewhat helpless in the face of such a dramatic scene. Lincoln I then turned to Zen and smiled faintly, "You're Zen Luo, right?" Zen nodded in response. "You're now my opponent for this round, which is not bad for a man with a cultivation at the 5th level of the life and death realm. Don't listen to my sister. Use everything you've got. If I can't defeat an opponent whose cultivation level is far inferior to mine, then I would rather not have my freedom." Zen felt annoyed, and once again muttered to himself about these siblings, proud personalities. On the other hand, Layla felt conflicted. She knew her brother's character. There was little to no possibility of convincing her brother in such a situation, so she was extremely anxious for this battle. "Make your move." Lincoln I's booming voice reverberated throughout the area. He took this battle quite seriously even if Zen was only at the 5th level of the life and death realm. Since Lincoln I said so, Zen lightly held the Thunderwind Divine Sword horizontally and made a polite gesture. After that, a beam of light flashed from the sword's tip. The lightning and wind blades carried a figure as they charged towards Lincoln I. Meanwhile, a handful of martial artists outside the ancient palace were talking about Lincoln I. Their discussion never seemed to die down. On the contrary, it only became more intense. Why didn't Zen admit defeat? I saw that Zen had intended to admit defeat, but Lincoln I didn't let him. What? Lincoln I is powerful, does he need Zen to admit defeat? What a joke. I think so too. Although Zen has some ability and has gotten to enter the final exam, I'm afraid he'll stop at this round since he's faced with Lincoln I. After all, even the son of Supreme Lord Winfred lost to Lincoln I. He was ruthlessly humiliated. It was the very reason that Lincoln I had been exiled. Chapter 1079, Exchanging Punches. The crowd's voice from the outside did not reach the confines of the illusion space. Layla had intended to watch the fight between her brother and Zen, but she was occupied at present with her opponent. "Focus on our battle, little girl." "Ha ha," he taunted. His derisive laugh was accompanied by a strange, ghost-like aura that emerged from his body. It turned into fist-sized skulls and shot straight toward Layla. At present, Layla's brother was fighting for his freedom. The thought weighed heavily on her even as she fought her own battle. She made no response to the warrior in front of her, her figure dancing gracefully in the air as her long hair swirled with her movements. Her eyes remained fixed on Zen. Zen attacked with his sword, and Lincoln let out an almost manic laugh. Golden light flashed from his body as he blocked the wind blade with his bare hand. Crack, crack. The next moment, the blade scattered into pieces. The lightning that struck Lincoln's body did not affect him in the slightest. Zen then used the Nether God Shadow, but once again, it was smashed to pieces. Having solved Zen's another move, Lincoln took large strides and dashed straight towards him. Zen remained calm even as Lincoln stopped his attacks one after another. The battle was his sole focus, he thought of nothing else but the present fight. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. In the blink of an eye, 10 Nether God Shadows shot out from Zen's hand. Upon seeing the surging Nether God Shadows, Lincoln roared. The golden light around his body became even more resplendent. The light clothed him like a second skin, giving him the appearance of a golden figure. The luminous glow was almost blinding. Zen's Nether God Shadows were strong and fierce, but stood no chance against Lincoln. As soon as they approached him, they splintered to 1,000 pieces. Lincoln has a profound comprehension of the metal law. This is probably going to be troublesome, even for Zen, a palace leader remarked. At this, another palace leader shook his head. That may not be so. Zen was able to cross the flame pool. He must have uncovered secrets unknown to anyone else. He had only used Thunderwind Divine Sword in the first 24 rounds of the trial. We still do not know what sort of trump card he might be hiding. Compared to the other warriors, the palace leader's appraisement was naturally much more accurate. As for the warriors from the 13 palaces, they had kept on flattering Lincoln, cheering at his every movement. After destroying Zen's Nether God Shadows, Lincoln took a step forward, quickly closing the distance between him and Zen. A streak of time law simultaneously erupted from Lincoln's body. In an instant, the entire platform began to slow down. The next instant, Zen undid the restraints of Lincoln's time law. The time law and space law were opposites, but they did not affect each other. Lincoln's action was only a probing move. To warriors of this level, knowledge of the time law was nothing unexpected. Nether God Shadows. After the time law was undone, Zen's figure once again retreated. One after another, Nether God Shadows continued their onslaught of attacks on Lincoln. Each of the shadows displayed a different technique as they surrounded Lincoln from different directions. Any other warrior would have been dwarfed by the relentless attacks. Lincoln, however, was no ordinary fighter. Useless, he said with a confident smile. This time, he did not even bother to defend himself. He charged forward, his body like a raging bull, and shattered the nether god shadows that were in his way. He moved with a power that could destroy even a mountain range. I know that you have more strength than this. Why don't we quit playing around and be more serious? He said aloud provokingly. As Lincoln got closer to him, Zen moved back the platform like a gust of wind, releasing one nether god shadow after another. Upon seeing that Zen was using the same trick, Lincoln shook his head. I've already told you, this is all useless. He kept on shattering the shadows that Zen released, and then said again, since you insist on relying on the sword in your hand so much, then I'll just have to remove it. Lincoln intertwined his hands together. Then, a golden ring appeared in front of him. The moment it appeared, Zen felt his Thunderwind divine sword being absorbed by a strong force, as if it wanted to fly out of his hand. He gripped his sword even tighter, trying to fight off the strange magnetic force. Zen was proud of his strength. But when he felt the golden ring trying to wrench his weapon out of his grasp, his heart raced. A trace of surprise flickered over Lincoln's features when he saw that Zen's sword remained in his hands. With another shout from him, the golden ring expanded to 3 times its original size, increasing its force threefold. Zen had remained expressionless despite the increased strength of the golden ring. No one would be his equal in terms of pure strength. The power of the dragon scales poured into his body, and his grip on the long sword became even more stable. It barely shook despite the powerful sucking force from the golden ring. Astonishment dawned on Lincoln's face as he watched his opponent. The metal law was his strongest suit, and no one had ever escaped the everlasting golden ring cast by him. He had disarmed his opponent every time. However, Zen's sword remained in his grasp as he dodged. It was the first time someone had ever been able to withstand this technique. What incredible strength, he thought to himself. Is this strength his trump card? Lincoln moved on from his surprise quickly enough. Once again, his hands intersected and the golden ring expanded once more. A profound understanding of the metal law allowed one great power. Each of the original laws had the power to destroy the heavens and the earth with enough skill and mastery. Thus, there existed a proverb in the upper world, there is no strongest law, only the strongest warrior. The laws contained boundless power, but similar to any weapon, they were only as strong as the hands that wielded them. A small smile appeared on Zen's lips as the sensation of an unknown gravity flowed through him. The strength of the dragon scales was swiftly pouring out. There was no way he would allow his own sword to be snatched away from his own grasp. As the fight went on, it became even more apparent that the two men were evenly matched. Lincoln grabbed the golden ring in his hand and gently spun it. Streams of golden light shot towards Zen, but he kept a firm grip on his sword. The two parties had come to a deadlock. On the other side, Layla had already activated her movement technique to the maximum as well. She dodged her opponent's attacks while simultaneously watching her brother's battle. I thought I already told you to be more serious, little girl. You'll lose if you're distracted, her opponent jeered. Layla wore a cold expression. She no longer had the heart to fight. So what if she won? All that mattered to her was her brother's victory. Things were different for her opponent, however. This battle held great merit to him. Victory would mean his freedom. Seeing Layla's dispirited face, he took advantage of the moment to press her closer. Zen continuously dodged the golden beams of light while keeping his strength to a certain level in order to prevent his Thunderwind divine sword from being wrenched from his hand. At the moment, he was in a somewhat passive position. The nether god shadows dealt no damage to Lincoln. Lincoln's metal attribute cultivation technique was overwhelming, but it was not that Zen did not have any way for a counterattack. He could use the nether god shadows to send Lavender to Lincoln's side. With her current strength and the cold plum blood spear, she would only need one spear strike to kill Lincoln. However, Lavender's identity was a very sensitive matter. Other than Yolanda, Zen didn't trust anyone else in here. Moreover, in a fight like this, he did not want to rely on Lavender's help. As he considered all this, Zen put the Thunderwind divine sword back into his space ring. Then, his figure flashed as he charged towards Lincoln. From the beginning, Lincoln had been trying to force Zen to engage in close combat with him. As he saw him move forward, a faint smile appeared on his face. He was most confident of his own body. He had trained the metal spirit body with the help of the metal law, his body was as tenacious as a divine weapon. No one would match him in close combat. Finally, he shouted, "You decided to not waste my time." Lincoln smiled. Zen's expression remained calm. He did not speak, but he felt his body hum with the power that had been long stored away since the start of the battle. Boom! Lincoln faced him head-on, returning the punch with just his raw power. At this moment, the strength of their physical bodies would be the decisive factor in the outcome. A loud noise echoed around the two men, followed by a drastic change in Lincoln's expression. Chapter 1080, Stars. Had it been any other Soul Sea Realm warrior, his body would have already been shattered by the force of Lincoln's punch. The number of warriors that had been smashed by Lincoln's punch in the villain world was countless by now. It was only because of his metal spirit body that he was able to survive all his battles to this day. Lincoln was well aware of his power, and took great pride in it. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to be surprised by an opponent. He did not have much reason to be, until today. The moment Lincoln came into contact with Zen, his body vibrated with a strength that was as vast and immeasurable as the ocean. The golden light on his body faltered, and he retreated on the platform. It was only when he reached the edge that he stopped. Such power! This brat's physical body is actually stronger than mine, he thought in disbelief, and a look of bewilderment appeared on his face. Every cultivation method had its own unique characteristics. He couldn't be certain which law Zen focused on, but it was definitely not the metal law. For warriors who practiced the metal law, their greatest pride lay in the body in the diamond-like state. How come Zen was able to make his body so tough? In his puzzlement, Lincoln failed to notice his opponent. Zen stood on the other side of the platform, his face mirroring Lincoln's own surprise. He had already used the strength of 8,000 dragon scales in the punch that he threw earlier. An ordinary warrior at the Soul Sea realm would not be able to withstand the power of just 2,000 to 3,000 dragon scales. Even War Emperor York had been forced back by a single strike from him. 8,000 dragon scales was out of the question. Had the War Emperor been hit with this power, he would have been killed immediately. He observed Lincoln from where he was. His opponent had been forced to retreat, but other than that, he showed no other sign of damage. Lincoln's strength was turning out to be much stronger than he had expected. Outside the ancient palace, the scene was punctuated with sighs from the spectating warriors. Close combats such as this always turned out to be among the most gruesome. The air shifted around the warriors as they watched. No blood had been drawn as of yet. They had no longer been thinking about the outcome of the battle. Instead, they were looking to see more blood. So this is your trump card, Lincoln said, his eyes sharply fixed at Zen. Your body is comparable to a divine weapon, and you possess terrifying strength. His lips split into a broad smile and he continued, however, this alone might not be enough to win against me. The confident glint was back in his eyes, although one could tell that he was exercising more caution. The next moment, a crack broke in his forehead, revealing a small cyan stone. Zen noticed the cyan stone, and his face also revealed a trace of wariness. At this time, he heard Lavender speak to him. Be careful, Zen, that stone you see is the wrath of the ocean. The wrath of the ocean? What is that? Zen asked. At the moment, Lavender didn't have much time to answer his question. There's not enough time to explain. It's something with a great history. Once this wrath of the ocean is activated, one's strength will increase exponentially. This is truly strange. Humans have actually arranged such a difficult trial in passing the torch. At the same time, the Sunset World Lord's gaze froze at the sight of the stone in Lincoln's forehead. The siblings both have the rare wrath of the ocean. Unbelievable. One of the palace leaders asked, since Layla has the fate to lead the world of chaos, what of her elder brother? Yolanda shook her head at his question. I'm afraid we would have to ask someone to inquire further before we can tell his fate. Upon discovering that the wrath of the ocean was something of extraordinary power, Zen naturally became even more vigilant. He fixed his eyes on Lincoln, watching for every small movement. Just as the two men were about to approach each other, a woman's shout echoed through the space, slicing sharply at the silence. Idiot off! I'm not in the mood for your pestering. Die! Layla's fury hardened her voice as she shouted. Ever since she saw her elder brother, she had lost all desire to fight. However, her opponent was persistent. Zen and Lincoln halted their movements, their gazes shifting to Layla's side. Countless ghost heads surrounded Layla with gusts of cold wind, forcing her into a corner. This is a trial, little girl. There's no way I don't fight you, her opponent said. But if you want to admit defeat, that's fine too. Layla's anger boiled over, flowing hotly into her veins. Throwing the cyan longsword to the side, she flipped in the air, her long hair leaving a graceful trail. The crack in her forehead grew larger and larger, and the cyan stone shone with a strange light. Rays of cyan light surrounded her. The next moment, a small spot between her eyebrows exploded. The moment he looked at the spot of light, Zen was overcome with the sense of extreme danger. That ball of light was an absolute threat to his life. As the people watched, the light spot suddenly enlarged and turned into a ball. It kept on expanding until it was the size of a person. Then, it wrapped itself around Layla. Once the light had completely enveloped her, it pulsated and began to rapidly grow larger once more. In a matter of seconds, the entire platform was engulfed in its light. With the light covering the entire space, Layla's opponent had nowhere to flee. He could only raise his hand against the blinding light as it swallowed him. The cyan light ball pulsated and sent forth a blinding light, forcing the people to close their eyes. When the large light ball slowly scattered, even Zen could not help but suck in a deep, much-wanted breath. What? The round platforms within the illusion space were built on stone pillars. Because the space's nature, the objects inside weren't real. They were created using divine textures and magic arrays. Warriors' strength was taken into account upon the building of the structure. Under normal circumstances, these platforms were impossible to destroy. Even after having endured countless battles, these platforms were left unscathed. They had been built to withstand long and violent battles. No one would have ever expected what came into their sight after the light dissipated. Layla's opponent was nowhere to be found. So was the whole platform. A sole pillar stood in the middle of the space. Had it not been for that, it would have been as if the platform had never existed at all. The stone pillar had a concave on the surface that was eroded by the light. Layla was sitting atop it as her hair was scattered down. Her face had a pallid complexion as she stared in Zen's direction. It was evident that whatever she had done used up quite a bit of her energy. It had burned even her blood essence. Everything was only a projection in the illusion space. Even burning one's blood essence wasn't too much of a matter. "Lincoln, you can do it," she shouted. With what had just happened, Layla had as good as passed the final test. However, after considering the situation, the old man in cotton clothes did not make her leave the illusion space, allowing her to stay there and watch the battle between her brother and Zen instead. On the other side of the Willow Island, Adrian's brows furrowed slightly. A bad premonition came to him as he watched. He had not the slightest interest about the relationship between Lincoln and Layla. All he wanted was for Lincoln to defeat Zen. Previously, he had thought that Layla was inferior to Zen. However, now that she had displayed such power, it had left Adrian astonished. At the same time, he grew anxious about Lincoln. He didn't want him to lose the battle. No matter how hard we try, some things just won't go as we wish. Fate is cruel, he muttered, shaking his head. His mind was resigned to whatever the outcome of the fight would be. Lincoln smiled faintly. His chest was filled with pride for his sister. After the wrath of the ocean was activated, the golden light around his body shone even brighter. He clenched his fists and turned to Zen. "Fight me," he shouted. Zen nodded his head in response. A silent understanding passed over the two men. The outcome of this battle was no longer important. Lincoln was as proud as Layla, but he was principled. It would not be easy to meet such an opponent. Zen's body thrummed with excitement. His gaze turned more serious as he looked at Lincoln. Then, in the boundless starry sky of the Orange Sea world, a few rays of starlight suddenly appeared. These stars had always hung above the universe, shining down upon the countless supreme worlds. But they were not visible due to their great distance. Such eye-catching luster was not often seen by human eyes. However, at this moment, those few rays of starlight shot straight towards the ancient hall. At almost the exact instant that the stars flickered, the Sunset World Lord frowned, and the expression on his face grew from bewilderment to shock. "Don't tell me Zen has cultivated the stellar body." A palace leader echoed his surprise. "It's the transcendent divine might that Supreme Lord Star had left behind many years ago." "Where did Zen learn it from?"